Hello everyone, I am the narrator and I am here to help you. Today, I know you used this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as fatigue. The second time I blamed it on stress. By the third time, I knew something was riding with me on those lonely night roads, something that didn't want to remain a passenger for long. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness as I drove down Highway 16. That endless stretch of asphalt cutting through the Nevada desert. It was just past midnight. The radio signal had died an hour back, and the only sounds were the hum of tires on pavement and my own breathing. I was heading home after a business trip to Reno, taking the back route to avoid traffic. That was my first mistake. At first, it was just a feeling, the kind that makes the hair on your neck stand up, like when you know someone's watching you, but when you turn around, nobody's there. I adjusted my rear-view mirror, scanning the empty road behind me. Nothing but darkness swallowing my taillights. The sensation persisted, my shoulders tensed, fingers tightening around the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I reached for the radio dial again, desperate for some noise to fill the car, but found only static. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, my breath fogging slightly in front of me despite the heater running. That's when my right hand twitched. It wasn't much, just a small involuntary movement like a muscle spasm. I flexed my fingers, shook out my wrist, and returned my hand to the wheel. Probably just fatigue. I told myself I'd been driving for nearly 6 hours straight, but then my hand began to drift toward the wheels, edge fingers extending as if reaching for something. I stared at it. Confused, I hadn't meant to move it when I tried to return it to its proper position. I felt resistance, as if pushing against an invisible current. Panic fluttered in my chest. I focused all my will on moving my hand back to the wheel. Slowly, with effort that shouldn't have been necessary, my hand obeyed, sweat beaded on my forehead. Despite the chill in the car, that's when I felt it. A pressure at the base of my skull, like cold fingers pressing against my brainstem. Not painful, but insistent, foreign. I reached back with my left hand touching my neck. Nothing there but my own clammy skin. The pressure increased and my vision blurred slightly. The yellow lines on the road began to wave and distort. I blinked hard, shaking my head to clear it. My right foot suddenly pressed down on the accelerator of its own accord. The car lurched forward, speedometer climbing rapidly, 65, 70, 80. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fought to lift my foot. It felt weighted down, as if someone else's foot was pressing on top of mine. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I yanked my foot off the gas and slammed it onto the brake. The car fishtailed tires screaming against the asphalt. I wrestled with the wheel, fighting to keep the vehicle on the road. When I finally got it under control, I was trembling. Gasping for breath, I pulled onto the shoulder and killed the engine, plunging the car into darkness so complete it felt solid. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical force. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam seemed feeble against the absolute blackness surrounding the car. I checked my arms, legs, neck. Looking for what I wasn't sure, everything appeared normal, yet nothing felt right. Gathering my courage, I turned on the dome light and adjusted the rearview mirror to examine the back seat. Empty, I exhaled a shaky breath. I hadn't realized I was holding. Of course it was empty. What had I expected to see? The dome light flickered once, twice, then stabilized in that millisecond of darkness and real illumination. I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror that made my blood freeze. A face, if you could call it that. More a suggestion of features distorted and stretched as if viewed through rippling water. But the eyes, God, the eyes were perfectly defined. Black voids without sclera or iris, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. I whipped around, heart threatening to burst from my chest. But the back seat remained empty when I looked back at the mirror. Only my own terrified face stared back at me. I sat there for nearly an hour, engine off. Flashlight clutched in my shaking hand. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and highway hypnosis. I needed sleep. There was a motel about 20 m ahead. I could make it. there, get some rest, and continue home in the morning. I started the car, the engines rumbled, providing small comfort in the vastness of the desert night. As I pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from behind the motel was a rundown affair with a buzzing neon sign missing several letters the night. Clerk barely looked up from his magazine as he pushed a key across the counter and mumbled something about checkout time. I nodded, paid in cash, and hurried to my room. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that pressure at the base of my skull return twice. I jerked awake to find my arms raised above me, fingers spread in unnatural positions. By dawn, I was sitting upright in a chair by the window, watching the sun creep over the horizon, afraid to lie down again. The incident should have ended there. A strange night, a tired mind, a forgotten nightmare. But 3 weeks later, driving home from a late dinner with colleagues, it returned. I first noticed my fingers drumming on the steering wheel without my conscious intent. A dissonant arrhythmic pattern that my hands had never produced before when I tried to stop the drumming continued for several seconds. Before my fingers responded to my commands, the familiar pressure returned to my neck stronger. This time it spread upward into my skull like cold tendrils probing the base of my brain. My vision narrowed the edges, darkening as if ink was seeping in from the periphery. I managed to pull into a gas station. Hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. The sensation receded almost immediately after I stepped out of the car. I stood in the harsh fluorescent light of the convenience store for nearly half an hour, drinking bitter coffee and convincing myself I wasn't losing my mind. When I finally gathered the courage to return to my car, I approached slowly like it was a wild animal that might attack through the windows. The interior looked normal, benign. I circled it twice, then bent down to look at the back seat. That's when I saw a smudge on the rear window on the inside. Not a handprint exactly, but something that resembled elongated fingers stretched across the glass when I opened the door to examine it closer. The smudge vanished as if it had never been there at all. I drove home with all the lights on. In the car, radio blasting windows cracked despite the cold. I made it without incident, but slept with the lights on that night and the next. Over the next few months, a pattern emerged. The entity I had begun thinking of it as such only appeared when I drove at night. At first, the episodes were separated by weeks, then days. Now it happens almost every time darkness falls. While I'm behind the wheel, the progression is always the same. First, the sensation of being watched, then the pressure at my neck gradually intensifying until it feels like ice-cold fingers are massaging my brainstem. My extremities begin to move of their own accord, subtle at first, then with increasing confidence, as if whatever is controlling me is learning how my body works. I've started to see it more clearly in reflective surfaces. Not just the rear view mirror, but in window glass, the chrome trim of the dashboard, the screen of my phone when it goes dark. A face that isn't a face, features that shift and flow like smoke underwater. Those black eyes, though, they remain constant, watching. Waiting, the tentacles are the worst part. Translucent, barely visible except when they move. Extending from where its arm should be, they reach for me, wrapping around my neck, my wrists, my ankles. I can't feel them physically. There's nothing there when I grab at them, but I feel their effect as my body responds to their guidance. Rather than my own will, I've tried everything. I've had the car blessed by 3 different religious figures. I've hung protective charms from the rear view mirror. I've recited exorcism prayers I found online while burning sage in the enclosed space, which only resulted in me frantically airing out the car before the smoke detector went off. Nothing works. I've seen doctors too, had brain scans, psychological evaluations, sleep studies. They found nothing physically wrong, though. One neurologist suggested I might be experiencing a rare form of seizure affecting my motor control. The psychiatrist thought it might be a manifestation of PTSD from a car accident. I was in years ago. They prescribed medications that made me too drowsy to drive at all. About a month ago, I tried to tell someone what was really happening. My closest friend, Alex, who I've known since college, we were having drinks at his place, and I deliberately stayed late so I'd have an excuse to sleep on his couch rather than drive home in the dark. I told him everything: the presence, the loss of control, the face in the mirror, the tentacles I could see in his eyes that he thought I'd lost my mind. He suggested gently that I check myself into a hospital when I refused. He offered to drive me home himself and dropped me at a clinic in the morning. I pretended to agree, then called a rideshare service when he went to get his keys. He's called me every day since, voice tight with concern. I've stopped answering. Last night was the worst episode yet. I had no choice but to drive after dark. My mother had fallen in her assisted living facility, and they called me at 9 p.m. Nothing serious, just a sprained wrist, but I had to sign some paperwork and make sure she was comfortable. The entity was waiting for me as soon as I turned onto the empty service road leading away from the facility. This time it didn't start with subtle movements. My hands wrenched the steering wheel hard to the right. Without warning, sending the car careening toward a drainage ditch, I fought back, muscles straining as I forced the wheels straight again. The pressure at my neck was excruciating, like ice picks driving into my spine. My vision swam with black spots in the rearview mirror. I could see it more clearly than ever before. A humanoid shape made of churning darkness. Its face a twisted parody of human features that kept shifting and realigning the eyes. Those terrible black pits remained fixed on me. The tentacles reached around the seat, wrapping around my chest and throat. Though I couldn't feel them physically, my breathing became restricted, as if my own muscles were constricting my lungs. My right foot slammed down on the accelerator of its own accord as the car H hurtled down the empty road. A terrible realization dawned on me. It wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to replace me each time it appeared. It gained more control over my body. It was learning, practicing, getting stronger. Eventually, it would be able to operate me like a puppet while my consciousness was pushed aside. With that understanding came clarity. I wrenched control back from the entity through sheer willpower, screaming into the empty car as I fought against my own rebellious limbs. I managed to guide the vehicle to the shoulder and slam on the brakes. The entity's grip weakened as the car stopped moving. I sat there gasping for breath, watching in the mirror as its form grew indistinct, fading like mist, until only those eyes remained floating in the darkness of the back seat before they too disappeared. I've done research since then. Real research, not just frantic Google searches in the middle of the night. I've spoken with paranormal researchers who think I'm experiencing a haunting quantum physicist who suggest I might be perceiving a parallel dimension overlapping with ours, and one shaman who believes I've attracted a parasitic spirit that feeds on fear and movement. The common thread in all their theories is that the entity is bound to the car, or more specifically to the act of driving at night. Something about the liminality of night driving. The isolation, the sensory deprivation, the monotony creates a condition where the barrier between realities thins. I'm writing this now as documentation, not a confession. I'm not crazy. There is something in my car when I drive at night. Something that wants to wear me like a suit tonight. I'm going to face it. I've chosen a stretch of abandoned highway outside of town. I'll drive there before Sunset Park and wait for darkness to fall when the entity appears. I won't fight it this time. At least not at first. I'll let it think it's winning. Let it reveal more of itself as it reaches for control, and then I'll be ready. The shaman gave me a ritual to perform, a way to bind the entity and cast it out. The physicist recommended flooding the car with specific wavelengths of light that should disrupt whatever quantum anomaly I'm experiencing. The paranormal researchers provided ancient words of banishment from 3 different traditions. I don't know which approach will work or if any of them will, but I can't keep living like this. Afraid of the dark, afraid of my own vehicle, afraid of losing control of my body to something that lurks just beyond normal perception. If you're reading this and I haven't followed up, it means I failed, or maybe I succeeded but can't bring myself to speak of it again. Either way, remember this warning. Be careful on night roads. Watch your rearview mirror closely, and if you ever feel your hands move on the steering wheel without your permission, stop driving immediately, because you never know what might be sitting behind you waiting for its chance to take the wheel update. It's been 3 days since my confrontation with the entity. I'm alive, I'm myself, but I'm not sure I won. The ritual seemed to work. There was a moment of blinding light, a sensation like electricity running through my entire body, and then nothing. The presence was gone. I drove home in blessed silence, my limbs responding only to my commands. But last night, as I was falling asleep, I felt that familiar pressure at the base of my skull, just for an instant, then gone. And this morning I noticed something troubling in the mirror for just a moment when I first woke up. My eyes looked different, darker, emptier. I think it found another way in. I think it's not bound to the car after all, it's bound to me. Story 2. The shadows in my grandfather's apartment seemed to have a weight all their own. They stretched across the hardwood floors like dark tendrils reaching for me. Even as I flipped on every light switch, I could find this place shouldn't have felt unfamiliar. I visited countless times as a child, but now as its new inhabitant, the space seemed to resist my presence. The air hung heavy with decades of memories that weren't entirely mine, and beneath the smell of fresh paint and cleaning supplies lingered something older, something that whispered of time. I hadn't spent here. I inherited the apartment 3 weeks after grandfather's funeral. The lawyer had handed me the keys with a strange expression I couldn't quite place. Not sadness, not concern, something closer to hesitation, as if he wanted to say more but thought better of it. I dismissed it as professional detachment after all. It was just an apartment in an old building. Grandfather had lived here for over 40 years without incident, a quiet widower hour occupying his days with books and his beloved record collection. The building itself stood like a dignified elderly gentleman among the gleaming new developments of downtown constructed in the 1930s. It retained most of its original character, ornate crown molding, brass fixtures that had darkened with age, and floors that creaked their protests. With each step, my apartment was on the 5th floor, a spacious 2-bedroom with tall windows that overlooked the city park. The rent-controlled status made it a miracle in today's market, and I considered myself extraordinarily lucky to have it. Max, my 3-year-old Labrador, hadn't shared my enthusiasm from the beginning. While I'd carried boxes up the narrow stairwell, the elevator was temperamental at best. He sat in the doorway. Refusing to cross the threshold, I eventually had to carry all 70 pounds of him inside, coaxing him with treats and reassurance. Even then, he huddled near the front door, eyes tracking something across the ceiling that remained invisible to me. The first night passed without incident, just the normal settling sounds of an old building and the occasional car passing on the street below. I attributed Max's continued unease to the change in environment by the third night he had taken to sleeping. Pressed against my bedroom door rather than in his usual spot at the foot of my bed, I would wake to find him tense, his ears pry-cricked forward, staring into the darkened hallway. It was the morning of the 5th day when I first noticed something peculiar. I woke to the unmistakable aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the apartment. For a groggy moment, I thought I must have set the timer on the coffee maker before bed, but I quickly remembered I hadn't unpacked it. Yet the smell was strong, rich exactly how grandfather had prepared his morning cup with that special dark roast he ordered from a specialty shop. I threw on a t-shirt and sweatpants and made my way to the kitchen expecting to find an explanation. The kitchen was empty, the counters bare. Except for a few unpacked dishes, no coffee maker, no cups, no explanation for the phantom aroma that now seemed to be fading. I checked the neighboring apartments thinking the smell might have drifted through the vents, but the apartment to my left was vacant and the elderly woman to my right didn't drink coffee due to her heart condition that evening. As I unpacked grandfather's books onto the built-in shelves in the living room, I heard it for the first time. The low murmur of conversation coming from what seemed to be the kitchen. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, just the cadence of speech, the rise and fall of voices engaged in casual conversation. Max's reaction was immediate and alarming. He sprang from his reluctant rest in the corner, hackles raised, and began barking furiously at the empty kitchen doorway. I called out, thinking perhaps someone had entered without my noticing, though I knew I had locked the door. My voice echoed in the empty apartment, and as suddenly as they had begun, the voices ceased. Max continued to growl, his eyes fixed on a spot near the refrigerator, seeing something that remained hidden from me. The following days established a pattern, morning coffee aroma, though I'd yet to unpack my own coffee maker. Occasional murmured conversations that stopped the moment I acknowledged them. Max barking at empty corners, particularly in the kitchen and the small study that had been grandfather's favorite room. I began to wonder if grief had affected me more deeply than I realized. Perhaps these were manifestations of memories, sensory impressions left over from years of visiting this place when grandfather was alive. I reached out to the building superintendent, an overworked man named Guzman, asking if there had been any reports of strange occurrences in the building. His expression momentarily froze before he shrugged it off, saying, "Only that old buildings make noises and play tricks with the ventilation systems when I pressed about previous tenants or any history I should know about." He became evasive, mumbling something about respecting the privacy of former residents before shuffling away by the end of the second week's sleep. Had become elusive. I would lie awake straining to hear the whispered conversations that seemed to increase in frequency. After midnight, they never resolved into distinguishable words remaining just beyond comprehension. Max refused to enter certain rooms altogether. Now, particularly grandfather's old study where I'd set up my desk. He would stand at the threshold growling low in his throat, eyes tracking invisible movements across the room. I began to notice other small discrepancies. Books I was certain I'd placed on the shelf would be found on the coffee table. Open to specific pages, the antique record player grandfather had cherished would be found with the dust cover raised, though I never used it. Most disturbing were the photographs. Old family pictures I'd hung on the walls. I would enter a room to find them slightly askew, as if someone had brushed against them in passing. My rational mind sought explanations. Perhaps the building settling caused vibrations that affected the frames. Maybe my own memory was playing tricks fueled by stress and poor sleep. I even blamed Max for some of the disturbances, though deep down I knew his fear of whatever dwelled here made him unlikely to approach the affected areas. The weather had been unusually turbulent that month, with sudden storms sweeping through the city without warning. On the Friday marking 3 weeks since I'd moved in, the sky darkened, prematurely heavy clouds blotting out the afternoon sun by evening rain, lashed against the windows with unnatural force, and lightning transformed the familiar angles of the apartment into brief, grotesque tableaux. I sat in the living room, a glass of grandfather's whiskey in hand, a habit I'd inexplicably adopted since moving in. Max huddled beneath the coffee table, whimpering softly each time. Thunder shook the building. The electricity flickered once, twice, then stabilized in those brief moments of darkness. I could have sworn I heard a chair scrape against the floor in the kitchen as if someone had suddenly stood up. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for the table lamp, pulling the chain with trembling fingers. The circle of light seemed pitifully inadequate against the pressing darkness of the storm. A crash of thunder shook the windows, and in that precise moment, every frame photograph in the apartment, 15 in total, flipped upside down on their hooks, an impossible synchronized movement that sent ice spreading through my veins. I sat paralyzed, the glass slipping from my numb fingers to spill across the hardwood floor. Max began to bark hysterically, no longer cowering but standing rigid. Facing the hallway that led to the bathroom and bedrooms, my breath came in shallow gasps as I slowly rose to my feet, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. Toward the bathroom at the end of the hall, the hallway stretched before me, seeming impossibly long in the dim light. Each step required tremendous effort, as if I were moving through water. The bathroom door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning Max wouldn't follow his barking, now transformed to high-pitched whines of distress. My hand shook violently as I pushed the door open, the hinges protesting with a low, mournful creak. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers numb and uncooperative. When the fluorescent bulb finally flickered to life, I found myself unable to immediately lift my gaze to the mirror that hung above the sink. Some primal instinct warned me against looking, but inevitably my eyes were drawn upward. Written in what appeared to be condensation on the mirror were 5 words: "You shouldn't have come back." My reflection stared back at me, face drained of color, eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't alone for just a fraction of a second, I could have sworn. Another face materialized behind my shoulder, older features distorted with rage, eyes boring into mine through the mirror's surface. I jerked backward. a strangled cry escaping my throat as I collided with the doorframe. When I looked again, there was only my own horrified expression and those 5 damning words slowly dripping down the glass. I fled the bathroom, slamming the door behind me with enough force to shake the walls. The living room no longer felt safe. Nowhere felt safe. The apartment seemed to close in around me, the air thick and oppressive. I grabbed my keys and Max's leash, desperate to escape at least for the night. As I reached for the front door, my phone rang an unknown number against my better judgment. I answered. The connection was poor, filled with static and strange echoes, but the voice that came through was unmistakable. My grandfather's distinctive rasp, though he'd been dead for over a month now. He didn't speak my name, didn't offer any greeting. All he said before the connection dissolved into crackling static was the study look behind the green book. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. Grandfather's voice, exactly as I remembered it, impossible, as that was the rational part of my brain screamed that this was a cruel prank or perhaps a stress-induced hallucination, but another part, a deeper instinct, propelled me toward the study I'd been avoiding for days. Now Max refused to follow, planting himself firmly by the front door, his entire body trembling. I moved as if in a trance, drawn to the floor-to-ceiling bookshelf that dominated the far wall of the study. The green book, he had said there were dozens of green spines among the hundreds of volumes, which, one and then I saw it. An oversized volume of botanical illustrations, its emerald binding faded with age. It protruded slightly farther than the other books, as if deliberately positioned to catch my attention. With shaking hands, I pulled it from the shelf. Behind where the book had stood was a small recess carved into the wall itself. Within this hidden niche lay a leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope yellowed with age. Both bore my name in grandfather's precise handwriting. Lightning flashed again as I carefully extracted these items, casting stark shadows across the room. The thunder that followed seemed to reverberate through my very bones. I retreated to the living room, unable to remain in the study a moment longer. I opened the envelope. First, the letter inside was dated just 3 weeks before grandfather's death. It began without preamble. If you are reading this, then the apartment has already begun to reveal its nature to you. I had hoped it would accept you as you share my blood. But I fear now that was naive optimism on my part. My hands trembled so violently I could barely continue reading. Grandfather explained in his methodical way that the apartment or something within it had been a presence in his life for 40 years. He had come to an understanding with it, a tenuous coexistence based on specific rituals and boundaries that he detailed in the accompanying journal. He had never intended for me to inherit the apartment, but had made provisions for it to be sold to a stranger upon his death. However, his final paragraph explained the change of heart. I have come to believe that passing this burden to an unknowing soul would be an act of unconscionable cruelty. You at least have the advantage of my warnings and accumulated knowledge. The choice now rests with you to leave and never return, allowing me to break my promise that my bloodline would maintain stewardship, or to stay and learn to coexist. As I did, neither path is without consequence. The journal contained 40 years of observations, incidents, rules, and rituals. Grandfather had documented every manifestation, every pattern, every method he had discovered to appease or at least neutralize what he referred to only as the presence. The final entry, dated the day before he died, contained only one line. I believe it has finally agreed to release me outside. The storm began to subside. The intervals between lightning and thunder growing longer, Max cautiously emerged from his hiding place to press against my leg. His eyes still fixed wearily on the hallway. The apartment felt different somehow. Not welcoming, certainly, but as if it were waiting assessing. I closed the journal and rose from the couch, a strange calm replacing the blind panic of moments before. With deliberate steps, I walked to each upside-down photograph, carefully writing them on their hooks in the kitchen. I unpacked my coffee maker and set it up according to the first ritual described in grandfather's journal, positioned exactly 3 inches from the wall, aligned with the eastern edge of the counter. By dawn, I had completed the 7 initial rituals grandfather had documented as essential for establishing boundaries. The apartment felt neither malevolent nor benign, but attentive. like a wild animal observing a human who has wandered into its territory. I understood now why grandfather had stayed all those years. There was more to learn here, more to understand than could be gleaned from running away. I wiped the bathroom mirror clean and replaced the message with my own, written with a steady hand. Despite the exhaustion that weighed on me, I am not him, but I am his blood. We will learn to coexist as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows. I heard it again, the gentle burble of brewing coffee, followed by the soft clink of a cup being placed on a saucer. This time, when I entered the kitchen, I found a steaming cup waiting on the counter, positioned at the exact spot where grandfather used to sit each morning. I took a careful seat, mindful of the precise rituals of placement and acknowledgement. Detailed in the journal, Max watched from the doorway, his posture still alert but no longer panicked. As I raised the cup to my lips, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow taking the shape of a seated figure opposite me. "Good morning, grandfather," I said quietly. Following the script precisely, I hope you slept well. The apartment would never be just an apartment, and I would never truly be alone here. But as I sipped the perfectly brewed coffee exactly how I liked it, though I'd never specified, I realized that perhaps this inheritance was always meant to be mine, not just the physical space, but the responsibility, the knowledge, the coexistence with something beyond ordinary understanding outside the city, awakened to a clear sky, oblivious to the delicate negotiation of space and boundaries. Occurring 5 floors up in an old building that had seen more than its share of history, I opened grandfather's journal to a blank page and began my first entry as the new caretaker of whatever dwelled within these walls. Story 3, "The darkness here is different." That was my first thought upon arriving at the Blackwood property, a growing certainty that something fundamental about the shadows in this place was wrong. They seemed to linger after sunset, clinging to corners with unnatural persistence, stretching when they shouldn't, retreating. When observed directly, I dismissed these impressions as the product of academic exhaustion, the price of tenure and 20 years spent hunched over medieval texts in fluorescent-lit university offices. This rural solitude was meant to be my escape, my reward, a place to finally finish my book on forgotten pre-Christian European rituals. I should have recognized the warning signs the moment I stepped through the threshold. The real estate listing had described the property as historic farmhouse, with character requiring renovation price to sell. What it failed to mention was why the locals called it the Watcher's House, or why it had remained vacant for nearly 30 years. I learned these details only after signing the papers, when the clerk at the county records office gave me a sidelong glance and asked if I'd heard about the old cult place. She wouldn't elaborate, but her expression, that peculiar mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine concern, stayed with me during the 3-hour drive from the university to my new country home. The house itself was a 2-story Victorian farmhouse with peeling white paint and black shutters, surrounded by 10 acres of overgrown fields and backed by dense pine woods. Inside, the rooms were largely empty save for dust-covered furniture left by previous owners. The air hung heavy with the musty scent of abandonment and something else, something accurate and unfamiliar that burned the nostrils. My first week passed uneventfully as I cleaned, made minor repairs, and set up my study in what was once a sunroom overlooking the western field. I arranged my books, laptop, and research materials meticulously. Academic habits die hard, and organizing my workspace has always been my ritual. Before beginning any serious work, I celebrated my first night of proper residency with a glass of scotch and watched the sunset paint the sky in violent crimsons and purples. That was when I first noticed the figure. It stood at the treeine. Motionless amid the lengthening shadows, a silhouette made indistinct by distance, yet unmistakably humanoid. I assumed it was a neighbor, curious about the property's new owner. I raised my glass in greeting, but the figure remained still. Watching something about its steadfast immobility sent a chill creeping up my spine. I turned away to retrieve my phone to call out a greeting, and when I looked back, the figure had vanished. Sleep came fitfully that night. The house made the expected noises of an old structure, creaking floorboards, settling foundations, branches scratching at windows. But beneath those sounds lay something else. whispers too faint to discern words but unmistakably human in cadence. I told myself it was the wind through ill-fitted window frames. On my third night, I began to explore the house more thoroughly behind a loose baseboard. In the dining room, I discovered a small hollow space containing a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. My heart raced as I carefully unwrapped it, revealing several yellowed parchments covered in faded ink. The language was unfamiliar, not Latin or Greek or any European script I recognized from my research. Sketched among the text were intricate symbols, spirals within triangles, eyes surrounded by thorns, creatures with too many limbs. My academic curiosity overwhelmed my unease. I spent hours photographing the documents, comparing symbols to those in my reference books, searching for any hint of translation according to my phone. It was nearly 3 a.m. when I realized I was no longer alone in the room. The sound that alerted me wasn't loud, just a subtle change in air pressure, the almost imperceptible sound of someone breathing who's trying not to be heard. I turned slowly, the hairs on my neck rising one by one like soldiers coming to attention. It stood in the doorway, a figure draped in what appeared to be a dark robe with a hood pulled low, concealing all features except for a pale, almost luminous face. Beneath where eyes should have been, there were only dark hollows like wounds in the flesh. My mouth went dry. My body turned cold as sweat erupted across my skin, running down my back. In icy rivulets, we regarded each, other in silence, neither moving than its mouth open too wide, impossibly wide. Revealing darkness rather than teeth or tongue, from this abyssal maw came not a sound, but a sensation directly into my mind. Knowledge waits for those who seek truths buried, wisdom forgotten. Will you learn? I blinked and it was gone. The doorway empty, the only evidence of the encounter was my racing heart and the dampness of my shirt, clinging to my trembling body. I convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the excitement of my discovery. I carefully replaced the parchments and went to bed, downing 2 sleeping pills to quiet my mind. The dreams began that night, vivid visions of ancient gatherings beneath starless skies, figures in robes circling standing stones, chanting in languages that hurt to hear. I was both observer and participant, watching and performing rituals that seemed to bend the fabric of reality itself. I woke speaking words I didn't understand, my tongue moving with practiced precision through sounds. No human throat should make. The following days followed a pattern by daylight. I researched feverishly, poring over the parchments I'd found and searching for more. I discovered small symbols carved into every doorframe in the house, subtle enough to be mistaken for natural wood grain. Unless examined closely, they match symbols from the parchments. I began photographing them, cataloging their locations, searching for patterns by night. The figure returned sometimes at the edge of the woods, watching sometimes in the house, standing at the end of hallways, or glimpsed from the corner of my eye, always vanishing when confronted directly, always with the same silent message. Knowledge waits. Will you learn? Sleep brought the dreams, each more detailed than the last in them. I learned the purpose of the community that had once occupied this land, a group dedicated to accessing what they called the spaces between regions. They believed existed in the gaps of human perception where ancient entities dwelled. These beings possessed knowledge beyond mortal understanding. The rituals were meant to open doorways to invite communion. I began losing track of time. My phone would show Tuesday evening when I could have sworn it was Sunday morning. My research notes became increasingly erratic pages of coherent analysis, interrupted by paragraphs and scripts I couldn't read while awake, but somehow produced in my handwriting. The university called, concerned about my absence. I explained I was deep in research for my book. They seemed satisfied, though I couldn't recall what words I'd used to reassure them one morning. I found mud caked to my feet and pine needles in my hair, though I had no memory of going outside. My camera contained photos I didn't remember taking, images of stone arrangements in the woods, symbols drawn in dirt, and in one, the lower half of a robed figure just at the frame's edge. My rational mind fought desperately against what was happening. I researched carbon monoxide poisoning, hallucinogenic mold species, the psychological effects of isolation. I tested the water, checked for gas leaks, even drove to town to have a doctor examine me. She found nothing physically wrong, but suggested I might be experiencing stress-induced episodes. She recommended returning to the university environment. I nearly did. I packed a bag, loaded my car, and got as far as the main road before a crushing migraine forced me to pull over. My vision blurred except for the continual appearance of symbols from the 7 parchments floating in my field of view. Like after images, the pain subsided only when I turned back toward the house. That night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I set up cameras in every room, motion detectors at every doorway, and prepared to document my experiences with scientific rigor. I sat in the dining room with the parchment spread before me, a digital recorder running, and waited. Hours passed. The house remained silent except for its usual settling noises. My eyelids grew heavy just as I considered giving up. The temperature plummeted, my breath clouded before me. The motion detector in the hallway chimed, but the camera feed showed nothing. I felt it before I saw it. That crawling sensation of being observed by something predatory when I turned. The figure stood closer than ever before, not in a doorway, but directly behind my chair. Its presence seemed to bend reality around it. Distorting proportions and distances, the pale face had changed, now bearing faint markings that matched the symbols from the parchments you have been reading. The wordless voice pushed into my mind, but not understanding. Not truly seeking my heart, hammered against my ribs. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold. I forced myself to speak, my voice emerging as a cracked whisper. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing. You haven't already begun to give." The hooded head tilted at an impossible angle. "Your dreams open doors. Your curiosity turns keys. The patterns are within you." Now waking, the figure extended what should have been a hand but appeared more like elongated fingers of smoke. It hovered over the parchments, then over my research notes, pages now covered in symbols I didn't remember writing. With growing horror, I realized the markings on my notes in the ancient texts were increasingly similar. My handwriting had transformed over weeks into something resembling the ancient script. I scrambled away, knocking over my chair. The figure remained motionless, but its presence seemed to expand, filling the room with pressure that made my ears pop. The digital recorder emitted only static. The camera feeds on my laptop showed nothing but visual snow. They tried to seal us away. The presence continued the town's folk, the frightened ones they buried. Our texts bordered our temple, scattered our circle, but knowledge cannot be destroyed. It waits. It persists. It finds worthy vessels. I'm not your vessel. I said, my voice steadier than I felt you already are. You came seeking ancient knowledge for your book. We are that knowledge speaking through time, through flesh, through you. Now I fled to my bedroom, locked the door, and wedged a chair beneath the handle. Sleep was impossible. I huddled against the headboard until dawn, watching the door, flinching at every sound. When sunlight finally spilled through the windows, I searched the house. The cameras had recorded nothing but static. The motion sensors showed multiple triggers throughout the night, but captured no images. My digital recorder contained only a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache when played back. My research notes, however, had changed. Where I'd written in English were now those same symbols from the parchments, but fresher, more defined, and I could read them without knowing how I understood the text. Described ritual preparations, purification methods, astronomical timing, requirements, specific arrangements of participants. The realization that hit me then was worse than any hooded figure. I wasn't being haunted, I was being recruited, prepared, initiated. I drove to town that afternoon, seeking stable internet access at the local library. I researched the history of the property more thoroughly, digging through digitized newspaper archives and county historical society records. What I found confirmed fragments from my dreams. A small religious community had occupied the property from the 1890s until 1927, when most members disappeared during what local papers called a religious retreat. The few remaining members eventually left, but locals reported strange lights and sounds from the property. For decades after the community called themselves the Watchers, at the threshold their belief centered around entities they claimed existed just beyond human perception, beings of immense knowledge who could be contacted through specific rituals. They believed these entities had guided human advancement throughout history by selecting worthy individuals to receive wisdom. I should have left then, sold the house, returned to my comfortable academic life, perhaps written a conventional history book about rural religious movements instead. But something had changed within me. The symbols I now understood, the fragments of ritual knowledge accumulating in my mind, the growing certainty that something profound waited just beyond my comprehension. I returned to the house as sunset painted the sky. The hooded figure waited at the tree, more solid than before, less a visitor now than a resident like me. We regarded each other across the overgrown field for the first time. I didn't feel fear, only a strange recognition, as if greeting a colleague that night. I didn't fight sleep. I welcomed the dreams in them. I stood within a circle of standing stones deep in the woods behind the property stones I hadn't yet found in my waking explorations, but knew existed. Robed figures surrounded me, their hoods pulled back to reveal faces marked with familiar symbols. They were chanting, their voices combining into harmonies that seemed to vibrate the air itself, creating patterns of sound that folded space like origami. I understood then the community hadn't disappeared. They had succeeded. They had found their way into the spaces between where time and flesh operated by different rules, and now they were showing me the way I woke, speaking their language. The complex syllables rolling off my tongue with practiced ease. The symbols in my notes made perfect sense, not as mystical signs, but as a complex mathematical language describing dimensional principles beyond conventional physics. The parchments weren't religious texts, but scientific documents from a science that had evolved along different lines than our own days. Blurred together as I divided my time between translating the texts and exploring the woods, searching for the stone circle, I found it exactly where the dreams had shown me. 11 rough monoliths arranged in a pattern that corresponded to a constellation not visible to the naked eye. At the circle's center was a flat altar stone, its surface covered with the now familiar symbols. The hooded figure appeared more frequently, sometimes accompanied by others. They no longer frightened me. They were colleagues, teachers, predecessors. Through wordless communication, they guided my understanding of the text, corrected my translations, refined my pronunciation of their language. I began to see the pattern underlying everything, how certain arrangements of matter, sound, and thought could create intersections between realities. The community hadn't worshipped supernatural beings. They had discovered entities that existed according to different physical laws, entities for whom time was a dimension that could be traversed as easily as we move through space. Yesterday, I completed the translation of the final parchment. It described not communication with these entities, but transformation, how a properly prepared human consciousness could be altered to perceive and eventually exist. Within the spaces between, the community hadn't disappeared. They had transcended tonight under a moonless sky. I will return to the stone circle with my translations. I will speak the words that bend reality. I will open the doorway. I understand now why I was drawn to this place, to this house, why my academic research had always focused on forgotten rituals and lost knowledge. I wasn't discovering something new. I was remembering something ancient, something waiting within me. The hooded figures weren't haunting me. They were welcoming me home. Knowledge waits for those who seek. I have sought, and I have found. Tonight I transcend story 4. I sensed something was wrong. The moment I stepped through the lobby doors, the air felt denser than usual, as though the building itself were exhaling stale breaths into my face. A dull hum from the fluorescent lights overhead reminded me how empty and silent the corridors could be after midnight. For weeks my shifts had been routine, watching the security feeds and occasionally escorting late working employees to their cars. But that night, every fiber of my being told me there was something else in the building, something that didn't belong. I remember standing in front of the elevator, my flashlight strapped to my belt, waiting for my colleague Marcus to join me. The overhead lights flickered once, sending a distorted shadow of my own silhouette across the polished floor. That fleeting distortion almost looked like it was reaching for me. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself it was just an electrical hiccup or my tired eyes playing tricks when Marcus arrived. He too wore a concerned expression. He'd heard something over the radio our supervisor had asked us to investigate. Strange noises on the top floor. Neither of us admitted it out loud, but we both felt a quiet, creeping dread. My heart started pounding the moment we stepped onto the elevator. Each ding heightened my anxiety, and I felt a sudden dryness in my mouth. I fumbled for the small bottle of water I usually keep in my vest, but my hand shook so badly that I nearly dropped it. The ride up was excruciatingly slow. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I could hear Marcus breathing heavily. The claustrophobic space intensified the sense that something ominous was waiting for us above. When we reached the top floor, the door slid open with a hiss that echoed through the empty hallway. It was too quiet, no hum of air conditioning, no faint tapping of keyboards, just a hollow stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The corridor, lights were on, but they seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange reflections on the glass walls of the offices. I rubbed my forearms as a sudden chill spread over my skin. It was so cold up there that I wondered if the entire HVAC system had malfunctioned. Marcus and I began our sweep, walking slowly along the corridor, checking doors and listening intently for any sound. My ears strained with every step, picking up the rhythmic thump of our footsteps on the carpet. We split up to cover more ground. I scanned one conference room after another, flicking my flashlight into corners that looked darker than they should. I never found anything out of place. Yet my heart wouldn't slow down. It was as if the building itself was alive, silently breathing in sync with my every move. At one point, Marcus gestured from across the hall that he had heard something. I joined him, and we stood together, pressing our ears against a heavy wooden door that led to the executive lounge. Through that door, there came a faint tapping sound like someone drumming fingers against a table, but when I turned the door knob and pushed it open, the room was empty. The overhead lights were off. The only illumination coming from the city outside. I let the beam of my flashlight wander across the furniture-polished tables. A few armchairs and unoccupied reception desk. The tapping had stopped. My breath came faster and my chest felt tight. Marcus thought he saw movement near the far corner. Advanced cautiously, sweat prickling my scalp. Even though the air felt unnaturally cold, I expected to find at least an intruder or maybe a lost employee working late. But there was no one. The tension in my shoulders built to the point that I realized I was almost holding my breath continuously. Eventually, we retreated back into the corridor to continue searching. We checked door after door only to find empty rooms. Then we both froze at the same moment when a sudden bang echoed down the hall. It sounded like a door slamming violently. I felt my stomach twist. Marcus and I rushed toward the noise, turning corners faster than caution would usually allow. My flashlight beam trembled on the walls, illuminating scattered office decor, motivational posters, potted plants, a framed company mission statement. Nothing unusual. Still, we both heard that door slam. It was loud enough to jolt the entire hallway with its resonance. We reached a door that appeared slightly ajar without saying a word. We approached it. Flashlights raised. The silence that followed was somehow even more unnerving than the banging had been. It was as if whatever had caused the noise was waiting just behind that door. I felt a bead of sweat slide from my temple down to my chin. My pulse quickened. I could practically taste the adrenaline in the back of my throat. Pushing the door open revealed a dim, unlit office, rows of cubicles stretched out in front of us. Everything seemed in order except for one detail at the far end of the room. A single computer screen was on its blank white glare. Cutting through the darkness, Marcus muttered under his breath. Though I didn't catch his exact words, the flickering fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and I felt a sudden wave of dizziness. The environment felt wrong. The air was stale, a stale that filled my nostrils with an almost chemical odor. As we inched toward that lit screen, the lights above us flickered and died, plunging us into near complete darkness. My flashlight flickered at the same time, and for a split second the beam vanished altogether. That instant of total darkness, broken only by the ghostly glow of the monitor, was enough to make my heart stutter. A numbing chill spread through my body, and I had to force myself to keep walking. My hands trembled so badly that I had trouble keeping my flashlight steady. Marcus was next to me, and I felt him brush against my shoulder, trying to stay close. Then our flashlights abruptly died, as if someone had flipped an unseen switch. I cursed under my breath, swallowing hard as panic flared in my chest. It felt like the temperature dropped another 10 degrees and the hair on my arm stood up. There was an unnatural quiet that pressed in on my ears. My breath came out in ragged gasps. I fumbled with the flashlight, switching it off and on again, but it refused to cooperate. Marcus did the same, but his also remained dark. The moment we accepted that the flashlights were useless, I noticed a presence. It was like a prickle at the back of my neck, a charged sensation that made my pulse skip. I didn't see anything at first, but my peripheral vision caught faint shifts in the darkness. I heard what sounded like footsteps shuffling across the carpet, slow and deliberate, circling us. My body tensed. Fight or flight instincts. Roaring to life, I forced myself to speak quietly, telling Marcus we needed to move back toward the corridor where the emergency lights might still be on. We navigated by memory, creeping out from between cubicles toward the door. Each step caused the carpet to muffle our movements, but I could swear I heard something else mirroring our pace. The darkness played tricks on me, suggesting shapes that weren't there, shifting silhouettes that vanished whenever I tried to focus on them. My throat felt so dry I could barely swallow. My heart pounded so loud I felt sure anything lurking in the room could hear it when we finally made it into the corridor. The dim glow of an emergency exit sign offered some meager comfort. The slight illumination revealed that the corridor's overhead lights had also gone out. We pressed against the wall, taking a moment to gather ourselves. Our supervisor radioed in, sounding anxious, saying he was outside on the surveillance truck and could see multiple shapes moving around on the camera feed. Shapes that looked vaguely human. He claimed they were walking up and down the corridors as if they owned the place. He asked us if we'd encountered a group of people, but we saw no one. My stomach twisted further when he said he could see us on the monitors, apparently talking to figures who weren't visible on the footage. My breath caught in my throat when I realized what that implied. If we were talking to something we couldn't see, it meant either we were hallucinating or these entities were invisible to the cameras. That notion made my skin crawl. I felt a freezing sweat gather under my uniform and my temples pulsed with every frantic heartbeat. Marcus looked as pale as I felt, though the corridors. Faint red lighting from the exit signs didn't help. He indicated we should keep moving, find the stairwell and get out of the building. We hurried down the corridor, passing office doors that seemed to groan when we walked by B. Every door we tried was either locked or led to a pitch-black room that felt even colder than the hallway. The sense of being followed continued, each step accompanied by ghostly echoes of movement that never fully revealed themselves. My mind started to race, questioning my own sanity. I wondered if the entire shift might be a collective nightmare or some bizarre stress-induced episode. At one point, we turned a corner and came face to face with another hallway we had just traversed. Moments before, it was as though the building's layout had shifted. I recognized a distinctive piece of abstract artwork on the wall, a bright red canvas with swirling black lines. We had already passed that painting earlier. My stomach did a flip and I felt the urge to sprint, though fear rooted my feet in place. Marcus looked equally disoriented, and we both realized we might be walking in circles. Despite heading in a straight line, a wave of claustrophobia overwhelmed me. The corridor felt narrower than before, the walls looming closer, and I could almost feel them pulsating like living tissue. My breath turned shallow and a metallic taste seeped into my mouth. I started to suspect the building was warping around us, leading us into some labyrinthine trap. That was when the radio crackled again. Our supervisor's voice came through in fits and starts, warning us that all the cameras on the top floor had just cut out. He sounded terrified, insisting we leave immediately, that something was roaming those hallways. Driven by that urgent tone, we forced ourselves to move faster, ignoring every open door and focusing on finding the stairs. As we approached the stairwell sign, we heard more banging noises, heavy slams as if multiple doors were being flung open and shut. The echoes overlapped, forming a deafening percussion that rattled my nerves. My mouth went completely dry. I tried to inhale calmly, but my breath caught in my throat. My heart thundered in my chest. The fear so intense it almost paralyzed me at last. We found the stairwell door. The small window set into the steel frame showed faint red illumination from inside, presumably from emergency lighting. I reached out and turned the handle. It opened. Relief momentarily washed over me, but as we stepped inside, we realized the stairwell spiraled down into an unsettling gloom. A soft, eerie wind seemed to blow upward, but there should have been no wind at all. In a sealed staircase, the temperature plunged again so cold that my hands went numb. Marcus and I started descending. Our footsteps echoed sharply on the concrete steps, each step punctuated by the frantic thumping of my pulse in my ears. My stomach churned a mix of dread and dizziness. I became convinced something was behind us, maybe only a step or two away. Several times I risked a glance over my shoulder, but the gloom revealed nothing concrete, just faint shapes that could have been illusions cast by the dim red glow. We must have descended several flights when we noticed that none of the doors we passed led to any recognizable floor. Each door was labeled, but the numbers were out of sequence, and the tiny windows revealed nothing but darkness. Beyond it felt as though we had slipped into some hidden layer of the building that defied the normal laws of architecture. Desperate, I tried the radio again, but only static answered. My heart hammered even harder, a frantic tattoo that blurred my thoughts. Finally, after what seemed like an endless descent, we came across a door labeled ground floor. I grabbed the handle, feeling the chill metal bite into my palm. I pushed the door open onto the lobby, bright lights flooding my eyes so suddenly that I blinked and recoiled. Every sense reeled from the abrupt return to normally. The wide reception desk stood in its usual place. The polished floor gleamed under the fluorescent bulbs. Even the security turnstiles looked mundane and ordinary. Marcus and I staggered into the lobby. Sweat-soaked and shaken, my breathing came in shallow gulps, and I felt tears pricking my eyes from pure relief. Our supervisor stood by the entrance looking frantic. He told us the camera suddenly clicked back on and he saw us appear in the lobby with no one else around. He wanted to know what happened upstairs, but neither of us could fully explain. We only mumbled incoherent accounts of footsteps and cold spots, glimpses of silhouettes we never quite saw, and hallways that twisted in on themselves. We left the building with him that night, still in our uniform jackets, and I felt a tangible sense of oppression lift the moment I crossed the threshold to the sidewalk. The cold night air outside felt strangely comforting compared to what we just experienced. My hands were still trembling, my heartbeat erratic. Marcus seemed at a loss for words. His eyes distant as if he couldn't shake the images that had haunted us on that top floor. Even once I was safely home, the fear lingered like a residue I couldn't wash off. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that endless hallway, the flickering lights, and the sense of being watched in the days that followed. I questioned my own sanity. I studied the surveillance footage which showed Marcus and me patrolling corridors, apparently holding conversations with empty air. I heard us responding to questions that were never asked. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it might be an elaborate prank or a faulty security system, but every explanation sounded hollow, a denial of something too disturbing to accept to this day. The memory makes my heart pound. That building is just another corporate structure by day, a polished testament to commerce and routine. But at night, something else stirs within its corridors, something cold, elusive, and predatory, feeding off the fear of anyone who dares to wander those dark floors. I never returned to a night shift in that place, and no one ever forced me to. Yet sometimes in the darkest hours of the morning, I wonder if it still calls out beckoning watchers into the gloom to walk those hallways, hand in hand with shadows that only appear when the lights go out. I'm haunted not by what I saw, but by what I couldn't see, by the creeping sensation that reality itself had twisted into a labyrinth of impossible spaces and fading flashlights. Even though I escaped physically unscathed, part of me remains in that upper floor, a fragment of my nerves, my certainty, my sense of self. I still feel it late at night, a phantom chill across my skin reminding me that once you glimpse that sort of darkness, you never truly leave it behind. Story 5, I awoke to an all-encompassing darkness that seemed to crawl across the walls, stretching its cold fingers into every corner of my room. It was the type of darkness that made me question whether I was truly awake or still trapped in the suffocating embrace of a nightmare. My skin prickled with an unnerving sensation like a slow electric current creeping along my spine. Even my breathing felt off too loud in my own ears, as though the silence of the house amplified every gasp and exhalation. It had been only a few weeks since I'd recovered from a grave illness that doctors struggled to define, and yet I wasn't sure if I had ever truly left that place of uncertainty and dread. Something in the air was different now, saturated with a tension I couldn't name, and I couldn't shake the persistent feeling that I was no longer alone. I remember the first day I was declared well enough to return home. My legs wobbled like jelly as I stepped through the front door, an effort so mundane yet monumental. Given how weak I had been, the walls of my house greeted me with silent indifference. The dull gray light of late afternoon filtering through dusty blinds. The doctors had warned me about lingering fatigue and the possible psychological aftermath of such a severe illness, but none of them mentioned the sense of being watched, of being judged. I shrugged it off at first, assuming it was a side effect of stress or the remnants of my own imagination. Yet every so often I caught the faintest whisper of movement where there should have been none, a shadow out of place, a flicker at the edge of my vision. These were mere glimpses, hardly substantial enough to stir real fear, but they were there during my first night back. I sat in the living room, forcing myself to watch an old movie in an attempt to distract my mind. I recall the faint hum of the TV casting wavering light around the space, the shadows dancing in time to my quickening pulse. My heart began pounding without explanation, thumping so forcefully that I felt it in my ears. I glanced around, telling myself that it was just the after effects of stress, but I couldn't ignore the sense that something was behind me. My palms began to sweat, and my throat went dry as if I were about to face an unnamed threat. When I finally managed to turn around, of course there was nothing there but my own reflection in a black window pane. Over the following days, these unsettling moments multiplied. I was haunted by the feeling of eyes on me whenever I walked down the hallway. Sometimes it felt as though I could almost see shapes drifting just out of focus, like translucent figures floating through the walls. I told a close friend over the phone about these odd sensations, adding that the constant undercurrent of dread was making it hard to sleep. He responded that I should try to relax, reminding me that my immune system and mental state were still fragile. I nodded silently, not wanting to argue, but deep down I suspected there was more to it than mere stress or hallucinations. One afternoon, while I was in the kitchen trying to summon the energy to prepare a meal, I caught a glimpse of something truly bizarre out of the corner of my eye. I saw a tall silhouette gliding across the hallway. It moved soundlessly with a fluidity that didn't belong to anything human. I froze, adrenaline tearing through my veins. My heart hammered so violently that I had to steady myself against the counter. Cold sweat dripping from my forehead onto the tiled floor for a moment. I felt sure I would pass out, every nerve in my body screamed at me to look closer to confirm or refute what I had just seen, but fear rooted me to the spot when I finally gathered the courage to step into the hallway. It was empty, convinced I was in the throes of post-illness delirium. I made an appointment with a therapist. I described my experiences in cautious terms, aware that I sounded unhinged. The therapist suggested that I might be experiencing severe anxiety or residual trauma. It all felt rational enough, but some part of me couldn't accept that explanation. I agreed to keep a journal, noting each time I saw or sensed something out of the ordinary. Over the next week, my journal filled quickly. The entries became more frantic. Heard faint whispers in the living room at 2 a.m. or shadows flickered across the ceiling. Could be the streetlight. I knew how it looked on paper, but living it felt undeniably real. Then came the night when I truly recognized what I was seeing. I was lying in bed, my eyes glued to the ceiling, trying desperately to fall asleep. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. My eyelids were heavy, but every time I started to drift off, I jolted awake with a sensation of someone looming over me. Suddenly, the darkness by the foot of my bed seemed to coil and twist, revealing a distorted shape. It was vaguely human, but stretched as though glimpsed in a warped mirror. Its skin, if it could be called that, shimmered with an ethereal sheen like thick smoke caught in the moonlight. The entity seemed to regard me with a chilling curiosity, tilting its head ever so slightly as though perplexed by my ability to see it. A surge of terror jolted through my chest and I gasped. My lungs struggling to take in air, my entire body shook as I realized I was looking into the featureless face of something not meant for human eyes. It was almost beautiful in its horrific alienness, a malicious grace radiating from its motionless form. Then it faded, evaporating into the shadows as if someone had blown out a candle. My heart pounded as though it might burst from my chest, and my sheets were damp with sweat. I lay there for hours, unable to move or look away from the dark corners of the room, convinced that if I so much as blinked, the figure would return. From that night forward. The entities became bolder. I started seeing them at random intervals, drifting through walls, hovering near doorways, and skulking in my peripheral vision. I couldn't hide the panic. These sightings induced my breathing would become shallow, my forehead slick with perspiration, and my throat would constrict as if I were being choked by unseen hands. I would grip my furniture to steady myself, feeling an icy tremor race down my arms into my fingertips. Occasionally, I'd sense them brushing past me, leaving a trail of cold that clung to my skin. It was as though they fed on my dread. Reveling in my rapidly deteriorating sense of reality in an effort to ground myself, I left the lights on at all times, but this only served to cast more shadows. Sometimes I'd awaken to find the lights inexplicably turned off. My heart would hammer so fiercely against my ribs that I'd feel nauseated when I switched the lamps back on. The bulbs would flicker in agitation, casting erratic patterns across the walls. I started to doubt whether I had truly recovered, or whether I was lost in some purgatory where these beings thrived on the fear I couldn't suppress. A creeping paranoia set in an unshakable feeling that every object in my house was being manipulated by malevolent hands I couldn't see. I tried telling the therapist that I felt as if these entities were feeding on me, that my anxiety and suffering seemed to draw them closer. She maintained a calm, professional tone, suggesting we explore mindfulness and relaxation techniques. She reminded me that after serious illnesses, patients sometimes undergo periods of heightened imagination. She asked if I felt I might still be in the hospital, as though suffering a delusion. I left the session feeling more isolated than ever, convinced that she couldn't possibly understand the magnitude of what was haunting me. My dreams, or what passed for dreams, became nightmarish landscapes filled with twisting corridors and flickering lights. In those dreams, I would see them waiting in corners, their featureless faces turned toward me. Sometimes I would sense them whispering, though I couldn't decipher the words. The nightmares would leave me drenched in sweat. My heart galloping in my chest, it got to the point where sleep seemed almost more terrifying than being awake one night. My friend decided to stop by, although I didn't tell him the full extent of my experiences. Still, he could see how pale and jittery I had become, and he suggested I get out of the house for a while. I hesitated, feeling a strange protectiveness over my home, as though leaving might make the situation worse, but I agreed. While we sat in his car, I explained in cautious terms that I kept seeing shapes and forms in the darkness, that I felt them in my sleep. My friend listened with visible concern, his eyes darting from the road to my anxious face. He tried to reassure me that nothing could hurt me if I didn't allow it. I heard him speak calmly about mind over matter, yet his voice sounded muffled to me, as though coming from underwater. That same night back at home, I turned on every lamp and let the TV blare in the background. My body was exhausted, mind teetering on the edge of collapse. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to an eerie silence. The TV was off and the lamps were dimmed as if the electricity had been partially drained. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing down on me like a thick fog. In the corner of my living room stood three shimmering forms, their outlines barely distinguishable, yet undoubtedly there. My heart thundered, each beat resonating through my entire frame. I could almost sense the cruelty in their gaze. Though they had no eyes, a chilling recognition washed over me. They knew I could see them, and they were toying with that knowledge. I tried to stand, but my legs threatened to buckle underneath me. Waves of cold terror rolled through my stomach, twisting it into tight knots as I managed to steady myself. The figures drifted closer, their presence radiating a paralyzing dread. My breathing went ragged, my chest tightening as though someone was squeezing it. I half stumbled backward, reaching out blindly for something. Anything to hold onto my hand found the corner of the sofa, and I gripped it with such force that my knuckles turned white in a moment of delirious panic. I wondered if I was even alive, or if the hospital had never discharged me at all. Perhaps I was lingering in some limbo where these entities were the real inhabitants and I was the intruder. My vision blurred at the edges, dizziness washing over me. I fought to stay conscious, pressing my nails into my palm, hoping the sharp sting would anchor me in reality. Then, without warning, the forms vanished. The lamps flickered back to full brightness and the TV blared to life with a sudden burst of sound. My entire body trembled, the aftershock of fear coursing through my bloodstream. I sank to the floor, the exhaustion in my muscles more than I could bear. I could feel my pulse against the back of my eyes, throbbing in a rapid, unsteady rhythm. I realized I had been clenching my jaw so hard that a dull ache radiated through my temples. At that point, I decided I needed answers, or at least some semblance of control. I rummaged through old boxes in my attic, searching for anything that might hint at a reason why these manifestations had chosen me. I had heard stories of people developing strange sensitivities after surviving severe illnesses, but I never believed I'd be one of them. The attic was dusty and cramped, filled with the stale odor of forgotten keepsakes. I felt the wooden planks creak beneath my weight, each sound causing my heartbeat to spike. The only light came from a small flashlight, creating an endless array of dancing shadows. I found nothing that could explain my predicament. No family heirlooms cursed by rumor, no diaries containing secrets of the paranormal. Yet as I sifted through the debris, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed by dozens of unseen eyes. My ears picked up faint scratching sounds, barely audible but enough to send waves of goosebumps across my skin. Each exhale came ragged and shaky, my breath condensing in the cool attic air. By the time I left, I was shivering uncontrollably, mind racing with possibilities that offered no solace. My nightmares escalated. The next few nights I barely slept at all. Every time I drifted off, I'd see those shapes rowing in the darkness, a silent swarm feeding on whatever panic they could coax from me in the waking world. My reflection in the mirror sometimes flickered with images. Not my own. Occasionally, an echoing thud or a scraping sound would ring out from behind locked doors. My hands trembled so fiercely that I could hardly hold a glass of water without spilling it. The boundary between reality and hallucination blurred dangerously. Desperate, I attempted to confront these entities. I found myself speaking aloud to the emptiness, demanding they leave me alone. Even though my voice quavered, my words echoed through the vacant halls, only to vanish into the oppressive silence. I could sense them gathering, drawn to my fear like vultures to carry in my stomach. Lurched at the analogy, I didn't want to think of myself as a source of nourishment for these monstrous forms. In a final bid for clarity, I decided to test whether I was truly in limbo or merely losing my mind. I forced myself to go. Outside at dawn, believing that if this were some twisted afterlife, perhaps I'd notice inconsistencies in the world. The crisp morning air stung my lungs, and I felt the rough texture of the sidewalk under my shoes. Cars passed by, headlights cutting through the pale light. Strangers walked their dogs, and the birds sang an ordinary if somewhat melancholic tune. This looked like the real world, but I still couldn't be sure. My heart pounded in my ears, and a sheen of sweat clung to my brow. If the world was normal, maybe I was the only abnormal thing left that night. The dreams came with unusual clarity. I walked through my home's corridors, the walls stretching, impossibly dissolving into swirling blackness. I heard them whisper in unison, their voices like a chilling wind rushing through dead trees. They spoke of hunger, of feeding on torment, and they acknowledged that I could see them. I felt their presence pressing in, creeping under my skin, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. I knew they wanted me to doubt everything, to question my survival, to question the tangible world around me. My fear reached a fever pitch, my body convulsing with terror as they drew closer, shimmering shapes enveloping me in darkness. Then somehow I found a spark of defiance through the suffocating dread. I forced myself to recognize that fear was their feast. I had to starve them of it. My eyes flew open and I was in my bed, drenched in sweat, heart pounding erratically, but I could sense them lingering, shimmering at the edges of the room. Every muscle in my body tensed as I rose from the bed on unsteady feet. A cold wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm me, but I stayed upright. Step by step, I moved toward the darkest corner of the room, refusing to let myself cower. My pulse hammered like a drumbeat in my temples, my breath coming in ragged bursts. I whispered under my breath that I knew what they were, and I refused to succumb. The air seemed to vibrate, an electric tension building. My skin tingled painfully, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end for a second. I feared I would faint. But then the oppressive heaviness eased, the shapes flickered, wavering like mirages in the summer heat, though my throat felt as dry as sandpaper. I stood my ground, forcing my gaze to remain steady in a slow, rippling motion. They faded once more, leaving me alone with my thundering heart and the echo of their whispered threats. The lights in the room returned to their usual glow, and a hush fell over the house. My body shuddered with residual terror, but I realized that I had not collapsed or lost consciousness. Somehow I had faced them and I was still there. I wasn't entirely sure if I had driven them away for good, or if I had merely proven to them that they could not take all of me. Perhaps I had proven it more to myself. Even now, I still can't be absolutely certain that I survived my illness. In the conventional sense, part of me remains convinced that I'm treading the border between this world and whatever lies beyond a precarious position that drew these creatures to me. But each day, as I open my eyes to the morning light and feel my heart beating in my chest, I choose to believe that I'm here truly. Here the house still holds echoes of their presence, a faint outline in a mirror, a hint of movement in a corner, a sensation of being watched when all should be still. Yet every time I sense them, I remember the moment I refuse to crumble. I live with the knowledge that they feed on the terror they elicit, and that they thrive on uncertainty. But I also live with the understanding that my own will is the strongest shield I possess. My nights remain restless, punctuated by dreams that border on the realm of nightmares, but each morning brings the potential for another day of resistance. I can't say I found peace, but I found a foothold in my own determination. The lingering discomfort is a constant reminder that something lies just beyond my range of vision, waiting for a crack in my resolve. Perhaps that's enough for now to exist in a state of vigilance, uncertain but persevering, free from their total control. And in that uneasy balance, I find a strange kind of solace, knowing I'm still fighting and I'm still here. Story 6 Flight. The moment I stepped back into my dorm room after a late study session, I felt something was terribly wrong. It was as though the air itself had thickened, weighing on my lungs and sending a shudder through my veins. The usually soft fluorescent ceiling light had become glaring, casting harsh shadows along the walls that seemed to loom and waver as if alive. Even the hallway felt foreboding, every footstep echoing ominously. My heartbeat pounded in my ears and a faint tremor crept through my fingertips. When I gripped the doorknob, I paused for just a second before turning it, already bracing for what lay on the other side. I will never forget the first time I noticed how much my roommate Vince had changed. We were college juniors sharing a cramped but typical dorm room. Until recently, Vince was the life of our floor, full of jokes, always ready to drag me to a midnight fast food run or an impromptu party. His laugh was loud and his presence filled any space he inhabited, but at some point it's hard to pin down the exact moment he withdrew. I recall an evening in late October when I returned from a weekend trip to see my parents. Vince was seated by the window, barely moving, pale as though he had drained every drop of sunlight from his skin. He didn't turn his head. He didn't speak. All he did was stare into the night with an intensity I'd never seen before. At first I tried to tell myself he was just going through a rough patch. College is stressful, people change under pressure, but then the rumor started. Classmates whispered that Vince had been caught in the library muttering to himself. One friend told me in a hushed tone that she'd heard him hissing in a language no one recognized. Another insisted that he twisted his arm behind his back at an impossible angle as though it were made of rubber. I dismissed these stories as exaggerations until I witnessed the transformations with my own eyes. It began with small occurrences late at night. I would wake to creaking sounds like an old rocking chair, only to discover Vince standing in the dark, his torso bent in an unnatural position the first time it happened. My stomach clenched with such fear that I could taste acid in the back of my throat. My pulse hammered and my skin grew clammy. I tried to speak to him, but my voice caught in my throat. And when I finally managed to croak his name, he whispered something I couldn't understand. His voice was raspy, layered with what sounded like multiple distinct tones at once. Some deep, others high-pitched, all clashing and swirling together. I convinced myself I was just groggy, half-dreaming. But the next morning he had bruises on his arms and strange cuts on his wrists, shaped like sharp, angular symbols. I had never seen when I asked him about the cuts. Vince brushed it off, acting as though I'd lost my mind for even suggesting something was wrong. He shrugged, half smiling, and said it was nothing yet. There was a peculiar gleam in his eyes, a coldness I could not associate with my friend in the following days. I found more of those symbols carved into his torso, his back, and even near his collarbone. He stopped wearing short sleeves. He wore a hoodie indoors. Even when the heating made the room uncomfortably warm, I would see the edges of the markings peeking out from under the fabric. They were dark red, some scabbed over others. Fresh each discovery sent a jolt of dread through me, and my mouth went dry every time I tried to question him about it. The strangest thing was how the environment itself responded to Vince's presence. Our dorm hallway, normally buzzing with conversation, seemed to go silent whenever he stepped out. The overhead lights flickered, the ambient hum of campus life, a distant radio. The murmur of late-night study groups would fade as if the air was being sucked out of the corridors. My own body reacted violently around him. My throat tightened and my heart beat so hard I wondered if he could hear it. His eyes, hollow and ringed with dark circles, would meet mine, just briefly sending an uncomfortable chill up my spine. One night I invited a friend from another dorm to hang out. We played music and tried to keep the atmosphere light, though the tension in the room was unmistakable. At some point, Vince approached my friend and bent down, muttering something she later recounted. Shaken that he had told her about a personal secret from her past that no one could have possibly known, she fled our room almost immediately afterward, leaving me alone with Vince's unsettling stare when I confronted him. My voice wavered and my palms were slick with sweat. He gave a chilling half smile and replied in a voice that didn't sound like his own, although I can't recall the exact words. The gist was that he claimed to know everything about everyone on campus, from the trivial to the catastrophic. He said I didn't want to discover what he knew about me. The tone was calm but dripping with menace, and I felt the blood drain from my face as my knees nearly buckled. From that moment it got worse. He began predicting tragedies. Small events at first, one night. He left me a note scrolled in a shaky script saying that a certain student would suffer an accident in the chemistry lab. I dismissed it, but 2 days later, that accident happened just as Vince had described. No one was killed, but it was serious enough to send the campus rumor mill into overdrive. Then he whispered new predictions, dorm-wide blackouts near misses car collisions, breakups between couples who seemed rock solid. In every case, his prophecies came true. Each incident convinced me further that something unearthly was influencing him. Some nights I woke to find him hunched over his desk, scribbling those same disturbing symbols in a thick notebook. The desk lamp threw flickering shadows across his face, highlighting his sunken cheeks. My entire body would tense and my pulse thundered as I watched him paralyzed by my own fear. My breathing would become shallow and I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. The room felt colder, as if we'd been dropped into a subterranean pit. At times, he would slowly turn his head and stare at me with milky eyes as though he no longer recognized me. My heart pounded so violently in my chest that I half expected to pass out on one particularly harrowing evening. After returning from a late-night library session, I found the lights out. The faint moonlight revealed Vince standing in the middle of the room. His limbs were twisted, contorted in a way that defied reason. His arms extended backward, his shoulders pulled at unnatural angles, and his neck arched so far that his face was tilted straight toward the ceiling. I froze at the door, my brain screaming for me to run, but my legs felt locked in place. The silence was absolute, broken only by a ragged panting sound that I realized was coming from him. A surge of panic burst in my chest and I tasted metal in my mouth. I wanted to scream but couldn't. He made a noise that might have been a short laugh, except it was guttural, layered with strange harmonics. I recalled stepping backward, fumbling for the light switch with trembling fingers, only to have the overhead bulb buzz and die. The instant I flipped it on in the darkness, I could see Vince's silhouette jerk violently, almost like a puppet with tangled strings. The edges of my vision blurred and my stomach twisted with raw horror. Then, with no warning, he shifted back to a more human posture. Still outlined by the pale moonlight, he spoke in a low murmur. Each syllable stretched out as though multiple voices were speaking through him. The only distinct phrase I caught was something about the future unraveling and how he had a role to play in it. My teeth chattered and beads of cold sweat dripped down my temple, trying to stay rational. I reached out to campus mental health services, explaining Vince's situation in vague terms. They believed he might be under extreme stress or experiencing a psychotic break. They advised me to encourage him to seek professional help. Yet I knew deep down this wasn't a mere mental health crisis. There was something darker pulling the strings, something malevolent. Wearing my roommate's skin like a costume, that realization settled in my gut like a lump of ice. My nights became a series of quick jolts awake, chest pounding from nightmares. I couldn't fully remember I was constantly drenched in sweat. My appetite vanished and I began to jump at the slightest sounds. A door closing down the hall, a branch scraping against the window. The constant feeling of being watched, even followed, sank deep into my consciousness. Sometimes it felt like eyes were on me, even when I was alone in a bathroom stall or hidden in a quiet corner of the campus library. One day I locked eyes with my reflection in a mirrored hallway and thought I saw someone else behind me, a shape that disappeared the moment I spun around. My breath came in gasps and I had to grip the edge of the sink to steady myself. When I confronted Vince about his predictions and the strange behavior, my voice shook so badly I could hardly get the words out. I asked him how he knew these things or if he needed serious help. He just smiled, a slow, unnerving spread of his lips, and said he had a direct line to knowledge that humans shouldn't possess. I remember the way my heart hammered against my ribcage and the sweat trickled down my spine. At the sight of his expression, his eyes were entirely void of warmth, like two black pits threatening to swallow me. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but some dreadful curiosity kept me rooted in place. A dryness coated my throat, and I had to swallow several times just to keep from gagging in the days that followed. I could see that Vince's body was deteriorating. His cheeks grew more sunken, and the symbols on his skin multiplied now, extending onto his legs and around his throat. He hardly ate, and yet paradoxically he seemed energized by some internal force. He paced at odd hours, chanting under his breath. I could pick out bits of what sounded like ancient dialects or unholy incantations. My mind reeled at the thought that he was channeling something far beyond normal comprehension. The air around him crackled with tension, sending goosebumps racing along my arms. Whenever I got too close one evening after returning from a group study session, I found the dorm in utter darkness. The hallway lights flickered so aggressively it looked like a scene from a strobe-lit nightmare. I felt nauseated. my stomach tightening into knots. The door to my room was ajar inside a weak desk lamp provided the only source of illumination, creating warped shadows on the walls. Vince was sitting on the floor with his back against the bed knees. Drawn up, his hoodie was off, and I saw the full array of slashes and carvings across his torso, some fresh, still bleeding, forming thick droplets that dripped onto the floor the moment I stepped inside. The door slammed behind me as though a gust of wind had forced it shut. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest as I stood there uncertain whether to approach or run. He began to speak in that layered voice again. This time he addressed me directly, weaving a tapestry of secrets related to my past. He described things I had never told anyone, secrets I had locked away in the darkest corners of my memory. My jaw clenched and terror prickled over my scalp. Gripping me in a suffocating hold, he said he'd gleaned these secrets from the entity within him, something older than time. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I realized tears had formed in my eyes. I wiped them away with shaky hands, feeling a cocktail of horror and disbelief. My own reflection in the mirror across the room seemed distorted, as though I too was slipping out of sync with reality. He pointed a finger at me, a slender, trembling finger caked with dried blood. Then, in a voice resembling a strangled choir, he revealed that the tragedies he predicted were mere amusements for whatever had taken hold of him. The real catastrophe was yet to come. A wave of dizziness crashed over me, and I gripped the back of my desk chair to steady myself. My heart was pounding so violently that my vision dimmed at the edges. Somehow in that moment, a spark of resolve flared within me. I decided I had to do something without any clear plan. I reached for the notebook he had been filling with those symbols. My hand shook uncontrollably. It was as though invisible hands were tugging it away, making the air thick and oppressive. My lungs felt tight and beads of sweat rolled down my forehead. As I clenched the notebook, I could almost feel it pulsing like it had a dark life of its own. Vince lunged at me, or rather the thing inside Vince did. Its limbs jerking spasmodically, my instincts screamed at me to leave. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, I yanked open the door and bolted down the hallway. Flickering lights overhead intensified the sense that something chased me, though I never glanced back. My feet pounded the floor in a frenzied rhythm that matched my racing pulse. Every fiber of my being was on fire with terror. By the time I reached the building's entrance, I was drenched in sweat and gasping for breath like I had sprinted a marathon. Outside, the air was cold, and I nearly collapsed onto the concrete steps. I didn't return to my dorm that night. I wandered aimlessly through campus, eventually settling in a 24-hour study lounge where the fluorescent lighting felt sterile but safe. Strangely, I was never confronted by campus security or forced to leave. Maybe I looked deranged enough that everyone was afraid to approach me. My thoughts spiraled. I questioned my own sanity. Could I have hallucinated the entire ordeal? The shifting voices, the twisted limbs, those symbols etched in flesh. Was it possible I was imagining all of it, yet the vividness of my fear and the memory of that vile voice told me it was horribly real? The next morning, I considered involving university authorities or the police, but how would I even begin to explain what was happening, that my roommate was possessed or that he was something worse? I had no physical evidence besides the strange notebook, which now felt too dangerous to open. Ultimately, I decided not to return to that dorm room. I packed a bag with essentials from a friend's place and contacted the housing office to request an immediate room change under the pretense of an irreconcilable roommate conflict. As of now, I haven't seen Vince again. I've spotted him from a distance on campus a couple of times. Still wearing that hoodie, still too thin, his eyes hidden in shadow. When our gazes nearly met one day across the courtyard, my stomach flipped and I ducked behind a pillar. I couldn't face whatever inhabited him. My pulse remained erratic until I was safely hidden in a crowded lecture hall. Even now, the memory of his contorted form and the echo of that layered voice haunt my dreams. I wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding like an alarm bell, convinced he's lurking in the corner ready to unearth more buried secrets. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd tried to help him, if there was some way to expel that entity before it fully consumed him. but the memory of his wicked smile and the horrifying predictions that came true are enough to drown any guilt I might have. Whatever is inside Vince, it was not meant to be trifled with. Occasionally, I catch myself second-guessing every shadow that moves too quickly at the corner of my vision. Paranoia gnaws at me, whispering that he'll find me again, that he knows the secrets I've struggled so hard to bury. I still have the notebook hidden at the bottom of my closet in my new dorm. The rational part of me wants to burn it to destroy any remnant of that malevolent force, yet a twisted curiosity keeps me from following through sometimes. Late at night, I catch myself staring at the closet door, heart-pounding cold sweat gathering on my brow. I feel a pull toward that hidden book, a lure so strong it makes my skin crawl so far I've resisted, but I'm not sure how long my resolve will hold. Even though I have escaped that room physically, a lingering dread hangs in the air around me. Every footstep in a lonely corridor sets my nerves aflame. Every distant flicker of light makes me jump. I can't unsee the shapes Vince twisted himself into, nor can I unhear that multiplicity of voices. Although I've physically distanced myself, I sense that this chapter of my life isn't truly over. A new terror has lodged itself in my consciousness, pulsating like a cyst ready to burst. And the worst part is knowing that no matter how many locks I secure or how many lights I leave on what's really haunting me now, is far more intimate and inescapable than a mere roommate. It resides in my memories and in the darkest corners of my mind, waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting for me to open that notebook and read what I've never dared to read. I live with the constant suspicion that knowledge itself, the secrets he whispered, the secrets I tried to hide, has become a gateway, and it might already be too late to close it. Story 7, I still remember the moment my eyes landed on that first distorted shape. It was late at night, and the cramped hallway of my apartment felt colder than usual. The air had a heaviness to it, an almost tangible, suffocating pressure that weighed on my chest. My heart kicked violently against my ribs the second I noticed something off in the corner of my vision. A dark silhouette that seemed to sway. Although there was no breeze at first, I thought it was a trick of the light or a result of my fatigue, but deep down I knew something else was happening. Something I couldn't rationalize. I'd moved into this apartment only a few weeks earlier, hoping for a fresh start after a messy breakup. The building itself was old, with narrow corridors and flickering overhead bulbs that never seemed to stay lit for more than a few days. The walls were thin, so I would hear neighbors rummaging around at odd hours, footsteps echoing through the halls at night. Initially, I chalked up my sense of unease to unfamiliar surroundings. Every new place takes time to feel like home, yet no amount of rational thought could shake the primal dread that clung to me. The first few days, I didn't notice anything overtly supernatural. I was just anxious. My sleeping patterns were erratic, and I'd wake up gasping for air, feeling as if someone had just been leaning over me. I'd put it down to nightmares, plain stress. The trouble began in earnest on the 10th night in that apartment. I was in bed, half awake, drifting in and out of uneasy sleep when I felt a presence. I couldn't see it, but every cell in my body sensed it. There was a pressure like an invisible weight settling next to me, and my skin prickled. I forced my eyes open, heart thundering. Nothing. There was only the faint outline of furniture cast by the glow from the street outside, yet the tension in the air remained so thick I felt I could slice it with a knife. If I had the nerve to move my arm the next morning, I noticed something peculiar. The coat rack in the hall, which I had left facing the door, was turned completely in the opposite direction. My first instinct was to blame my own forgetfulness, though that explanation didn't entirely sit right. I had a vague memory of hearing faint creaks during the night, like something being dragged across the floor, but it could have been a dream. Still, I walked away uneasy, trying to shrug it off a few days past with little more than fleeting moments of dread. But whenever I turned off the lights, I could sense movement in the shadows. Sometimes I caught it only when I blinked a slow shuffle, a silhouette that would freeze as soon as my eyes snapped open. It got to the point where I started leaving certain lights on at all hours just to keep the darkness at bay. My electricity bill soared, but the expense felt like a small price to pay for some semblance of peace. Then I began to see two distinct figures. One seemed almost humanoid, though utterly black, as if made of pure void. No facial features, no details of clothing, just a jagged, inky outline that would ooze into corners and vanish. Whenever I tried to look directly at it, the other was more unsettling in its definition. Its shape bore the suggestion of a tall figure in outdated formal attire, like an old-fashioned tuxedo with coattails I could even make out when the light caught it. Just right, what seemed like a top hat resting on an elongated head. The form was grainy, flickering always seen at the edges of my vision, yet it was undeniably there, moving in unnatural ways against the direction of the light itself. Those first sightings rattled me, made me question my sanity. I considered calling a friend or a professional, maybe checking in with a therapist, but each day I convinced myself I was just tired, that these were illusions created by stress. I trudged through work with a pounding headache. My nerves frayed, the constant sense of being watched lingered throughout the day. It became difficult to focus on anything but that itch in the back of my brain, warning me that someone or something was in the apartment with me. The most unnerving moment came on a Sunday afternoon when I decided to take some pictures of my new place. I wanted to show my family that I was adjusting, try to capture the charm of the old architecture. I snapped photos of the living room, the cramped kitchen, and my bedroom later. When I sat down to review them, my heart nearly stopped in one of the pictures. Nothing but the living room with its threadbare rug and a single window. There was a faint shape near the couch. It looked like the silhouette with the old-fashioned formal attire, except it was contorted. The posture was all wrong. The head appeared angled, as if peeking from behind the couch to stare directly at the camera. A wave of cold sweat covered me from head to toe, and I felt my hands tremble so violently I almost dropped my phone. My mouth went dry and my pulse throbbed in my ears, relentless and staccato. After that, everything escalated. The scratchy feeling of eyes on me followed me constantly. The nights turned into a cycle of terror, dozing off against my will, then jerking awake to the sensation of something brushing against my hair or shoulder. My heart would race so hard I swore it might burst through my ribcage. I'd fumble for the lamp, desperate for light, but every time I flicked it on, the room was empty. One evening, I found a message formed on my kitchen table. Several objects, pens, forks, a notepad had been arranged in such a way that they spelled out a single word. The letters were lopsided, as if made by an unsteady hand, yet unmistakable. My stomach twisted into knots and my entire body erupted in goosebumps. Though I felt a near overwhelming urge to run, I also felt strangely rooted to the spot. A part of me was furious, refusing to be terrorized in my own home. Another part of me was gripped with such raw fear that I could barely get a breath past my clenched throat. Night after night, I felt the presence of those shadows more acutely. I'd noticed them out of the corner of my eye, blending into dark corners or gliding along the ceiling. Sometimes I thought I could hear distant whispers, but they were so quiet, I couldn't make out words, if they were words at all. I tried to record these sounds on my phone, but I never captured anything definitive, at least not at first. The real horror set in when I woke up one morning with strange marks around my neck. They looked like handprints, faint bruises that wrapped around my throat. My first reaction was to run my fingers over the sore spots, my breath hitching as a jolt of pain seared through me. The realization that someone had laid hands on me while I slept made my stomach churn. Nausea welled up and I had to brace myself against the bathroom sink, panting in a cold sweat. My reflection in the mirror was unrecognizable. Eyes, bloodshot skin, pallid, a sheen of terror etched in every line of my face. Shortly after noticing the marks, I decided to go through my phone in a desperate attempt to find any clue that was... When I discovered recordings I didn't remember making, they were all audio files unlabeled with timestamps in the middle of the night. Times I should have been asleep. My skin crawled as I pressed play on the first one. At first it was just static and faint shuffling. Then a voice emerged, distorted and low. It sounded a bit like me, but layered with another pitch, as if two voices were speaking in unison. The words were jumbled. something about darkness, and it's here. I started to shake uncontrollably. My throat tightened and tears threatened to blur my vision. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Some of the phrases were too garbled to make out, but I caught fragments. Must leave, can't escape. They watched tonight. Each subsequent recording was similarly disturbing, and at times I heard that faint whispering again, as though in the background it felt like eavesdropping on a conversation in which I was both speaker and listener. I fought the urge to smash my phone against the wall out of sheer terror and confusion. My sense of reality began to erode. I couldn't trust my own memories, couldn't trust what my eyes were telling me. The next few nights were a blur of half-slept hours punctured by jarring noises, a sudden knock on the wall, a scrape of furniture across the floor, an abrupt shift in temperature that left me shivering. Despite thick blankets sometimes in the dim haze of near sleep, I felt the mattress dip beside me as if someone was climbing into bed. My body would freeze, adrenaline surging so fast it felt like my veins were filled with ice water. I started trying to fight back by rearranging the apartment, attempting to remove potential hiding places for these shadows. I replaced my thin curtains with heavier ones to block out the flickering street lights, hoping fewer moving beams would reduce the illusions, but nothing changed, if anything. The activity intensified. Twice I found new messages spelled out with random household items now and gone, which left me trembling so badly I had to sit on the floor to steady my breathing. My appetite diminished to almost nothing. Every bite of food felt like a chore. My stomach in perpetual knots. My boss began to comment on my haggarded appearance. He mentioned I looked like I hadn't slept in days, which was painfully accurate. I shared a sanitized version of my situation with him, saying I believed someone was breaking into my apartment. He urged me to go to the police. But what could I even say to them that living shadows were creeping around my home, leaving cryptic messages and bruises on my neck? It sounded insane, even to my own ears. I rationalized that I had no solid evidence, aside from the ephemeral shadows and those bizarre recordings that made me sound unhinged. I decided to bring a friend over in the hope that a witness would confirm I wasn't imagining everything. However, I never quite got to lay out all the facts. He was just there for a casual visit, and I tried to act normal. We were chatting in my living room more, like I was rambling anxiously while he listened, when the overhead light began to flicker violently. My friend mentioned feeling a sudden draft cold enough to make the hair on his arm stand up. I saw his expression shift from casual concern to genuine alarm. He glanced over my shoulder and his eyes went wide. Then the bulb blew with a sharp pop that made us both jump. By the time we replaced the bulb and turned the lights back on, the presence he thought he'd seen behind me was gone. He left soon after, muttering that the place had bad vibes. It was the closest thing to validation I'd had. Though it offered no real comfort that night, I resolved to set up my phone camera and attempt to record myself sleeping. I wanted proof of whatever was happening. Some shred of evidence that would confirm I wasn't descending into madness before crawling into bed. I arranged the phone on a chair, angled it so the lens would capture my entire bed. And most of the bedroom floor. I left the lamp on its lowest setting, just enough light for the camera to see. Then I tried to sleep. It was the longest night of my life. Every small sound or shift in the air made my pulse hammer so fast I thought my heart might burst. Eventually, I drifted into a restless slumber. I had nightmares where I saw the faceless black shape looming at the foot of my bed, while the tall figure in formal attire stood in the corner, whispering my name in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scratching across pavement. I woke up many times, drenched in sweat, swallowing the thick lump of terror in my throat. In the morning, I forced myself to watch the footage. Most of it was just me tossing and turning, but at around 3 a.m., a flickering distortion appeared near the bed. My body tensed when I saw the tall, grainy silhouette step into frame. The figure was impossibly thin, dark lines rippling as if made of shadowy smoke. I watched with growing horror as it bent forward, its elongated arms reaching toward my sleeping form. Then the screen glitched and the recording turned to static. For several seconds, when it cleared, the silhouette was gone and I was lying there with my mouth slightly open, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. That was enough. I decided I had to leave. I didn't care about losing the deposit or what others might think. I felt certain that staying one more night would drive me over the edge, or something worse might happen that evening. As I tried to pack my things, I felt a suffocating presence behind me. My breath caught in my throat and my muscles locked in the reflection of my turned-off TV screen. I saw them, the two shadows standing behind me, each contorted in an impossible way. My hands began to tremble so violently that I dropped my clothes on the floor, heart thudding like a war drum in my chest. I stared at the reflection, sweat trickling down my temple. Every breath a shaky gasp. The formal shadow looked like it was leaning closer, had gliding at a diagonal angle as if studying me. The featureless black silhouette seemed to vibrate with an energy that made my teeth clench. A final surge of adrenaline kicked in and I spun around. They vanished, leaving me alone in the silent room with pounding blood in my ears. The last thing I did was record a brief video message for myself, just in case I wanted a clear statement of what was happening. The moving shadows, the marks on my neck, the messages spelled out with my belongings. I felt a desperate need to have a record to confirm that this was real and not a product of my unraveling mind. My voice shook as I spoke, tears burning in my eyes. Then I left, stumbling down the hallway and out into the night in Overstead. Backpack slung over my shoulder, I never returned to that apartment. I made arrangements to have the rest of my things moved by professionals who said nothing unusual happened while they were there, though they admitted the apartment felt uncomfortable. Even now, whenever I close my eyes, I can picture those shifting shapes waiting just beyond the darkness. Sometimes I'll glance at an innocuous shadow on a wall or behind a door and feel that same pulse of terror surge up my spine. My heart races, my mouth goes dry, and for a split second I'm back in that stifling apartment, certain that if I blink I'll see those figures again. I don't know if the shadows were manifestations of something truly supernatural, or if I was experiencing a psychological breakdown amplified by stress and fear, but either possibility leaves me haunted. The memory of those silhouettes moving against the light and forming menacing messages still keeps me awake on restless nights, and every so often I check my phone's audio recordings in dread, half expecting to find new files. I don't remember making new warnings or whispered threats. That's when my pulse pounds, my sweat turns icy, and I realize that escape isn't always a matter of leaving a place. Sometimes the things we fear the most follow us, long after we believe we've left them behind. Story 8. I felt the shift in the air the moment I opened the door to my home office, as though the shadows had grown heavier in my absence. An intense quiet clung to the room, a silence so thick it seemed to press against my eardrums. Even the soft hum of my computer tower sounded muffled. My heart rate accelerated without any logical reason, and I tasted a faint bitterness on my tongue, as if anxiety itself had left a residue. That night, the gloom of the overhead light seemed more oppressive than usual, revealing dust motes swirling in slow motion. It was then that I saw the first of those symbols, almost invisible at first glance, but so distinct in the dust that covered the wooden floorboards. I remember bending down, eyes fixed on those strange swirly marks. Each line was meticulously drawn, as though etched with a steady hand. Their style reminded me of ancient sigils I had seen long ago in an old book of occult imagery, although I couldn't recall exactly where. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt a subtle sense of dread creep up my spine. It felt as if someone or something had been standing there moments before I arrived, waiting for me to discover the evidence of its presence. I brushed the symbols away with my foot, thinking it must have been my imagination. Yet a seed of unease lodged itself in my mind, and no amount of dismissive self-tea-talk could uproot it. Over the next few days, the designs I created for clients, the very same designs I spent hours polishing, began to change by morning. Elements of the images would shift position or take on darker, distorted aspects, as though someone had opened the files and tampered with them behind my back. I could almost swear I had saved them in perfect condition the night before, only to wake and find bizarre shapes in the negative space faces, bent out of proportion in a horrifying grin, and lines of text in an alphabet I didn't recognize. At first, I suspected software corruption or a possible virus, yet nothing I did could replicate the glitch or restore the original files. Checking backup simply led me to find the same disturbing alterations copied over them as if the changes had been burned into every layer. I found myself starting to doubt my own perceptions. I would review the altered work, then search frantically for the original versions, my fingers shaking as I typed frenzied searches into my system. But every trace of the original files had somehow vanished. A stubborn chill set in my gut, and I felt a prickly heat on the back of my neck, convinced that I was being watched. On some nights, I walked into the office to find not just one new symbol, but an entire pattern. Drawn in the dust, it would stretch from one corner of the room to the other, spiraling toward the chair where I spent my nights hunched over design software. Those symbols never looked the same twice, always evolving, always more intricate. Each new iteration embedding itself deeper into my subconscious. I tried to explain these strange occurrences to a close friend once over the phone. I gave an awkward, halting summary of the bizarre shifts in my files and the unexplainable signs scrolled in dust. My friend asked if I'd been working too many hours, if perhaps I needed to step away from the screen and catch my breath. I could sense the skepticism in his voice, though he tried to hide it, feeling embarrassed. I thanked him for listening and ended the call, but doubt cut a raw path through my mind, magnified by a twisting ball of unease in my stomach. I felt alone in my home office with the walls closing in. Clients started reporting troubling dreams after previewing my work. One client mentioned feeling sick to their stomach. Whenever they looked at the design revisions I'd sent, another expressed concern about images of nameless figures showing up in her dreams. The nightmares they described, tunnels of flickering shadows. Voices whispering unintelligible incantations began to sound eerily similar. They all mentioned a growing sense of dread that continued even after they woke up, leaving them drenched in sweat and struggling to shake off the fear. Whenever they would describe these experiences, I felt a tremor in my own chest, an echo of the terror seizing them. I apologized, offering partial refunds and desperately trying to remove or replace the questionable imagery. But every time I attempted to fix the files, they ended up more warped the next day during one particularly restless night. I was jolted awake by a vibration in the floor at first. I thought it was just my imagination, a nightmare lingering in my half-sleeping mind, but I heard the faintest scraping sound, like a slow, deliberate movement just beyond my office door. The air in the hallway felt colder as I crept toward the room, sweaty palms making it hard to keep my grip on the door handle. My heart was hammering in my chest, my mouth drier than sandpaper pushing the door open. I caught the tang of stale dust in my nostrils. The lamp on my desk flickered. I forced myself to flick on the main ceiling. Light bracing for whatever I might see inside the floor was covered in symbols again, but this time they had expanded upward onto the walls. Strange shapes and curling lines formed a labyrinth of cryptic script that nearly made me dizzy. It was as though some invisible hand had dragged a finger across every surface, carving out patterns in the fine layer of dust. My breath caught, and for a moment I was too stunned to move. I could have sworn the lines were faintly pulsing as if they were alive. Breathing in unison, when I blinked, the sensation vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of horror. At the scope of it, no rational explanation could account for how those symbols had made their way onto walls higher than my own reach. I spent the rest of that night frantically cleaning, the physical act of wiping every inch of the office. Scrubbing away each mark gave me temporary relief, a chance to channel my growing panic into something productive. Sweat poured down my temples and my arms ached from the repetitive motion. Each time I paused to catch my breath, I felt eyes on me, some intangible presence lurking in the corner of my peripheral vision. I refused to look over my shoulder, terrified of what I might see. Eventually, I collapsed into bed in the early morning, exhausted. It was asleep, weighed down by unease, and I woke only a few hours later with my heart still racing. Things started escalating when the altered designs began to incorporate whispered recordings. One day I opened a project file to find an audio track embedded where none had been before. It was low, guttural chanting, In a language I couldn't identify, the words repeated in a cyclical pattern that made my skin crawl. My eardrums felt strained, just listening to the scratchy hum of it. The track itself was intangible within the program. I couldn't mute it or delete it. It felt like an audio parasite latched onto my work. Changing the whole composition's emotional tone, clients kept calling with complaints of eerie humming or muttering in the background of promotional materials I'd sent them. One client mentioned that people in his office had gotten chills when they played the video clip, claiming they felt an inexplicable heaviness in the room, as if the walls were about to collapse. Another reported feeling a hand brushing the back of her neck whenever she watched the design slide. These conversations left me with a pit in my stomach, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold my phone. I started to fear that my professional reputation was on the verge of total collapse, and worse, something malevolent might be using my skills as a gateway. As the days passed, I caught flickers of movement from the corner of my eye while I worked on my computer. Sometimes it appeared to be a shadow creeping across the screen, an elongation that shouldn't be there. Other times I glimpsed what I thought was a face contorted in agony. Pressed against the digital layers of my designs, I could feel my own sanity unraveling in slow motion. The boundary between what was real and what was imagined was slipping. My entire body buzzed with paranoia. Every phone ring, every house creak made me jump nerves on edge. Sleep no longer offered any reprieve. In the few hours I managed to rest, I dreamed of labyrinths made of wires and digital lines pulsating with eldritch symbols. In those dreams, I wandered corridors lined with my own altered work. The designs came alive, whispering my name with voice distortions that made me jolt awake drenched in sweat. Heart pounding as if I'd run a marathon, each awakening left me gasping for air, disoriented by the feeling that something had followed me out of the dream and lingered in the dark corners of my bedroom. Finally, I decided I had to confront whatever was happening one evening, determined to catch the cause of these symbols. In the act, I set up a camera to record my office overnight. I told myself this would be the logical step to prove whether I was losing my mind or if someone was physically breaking in. I positioned the camera in a corner near the ceiling and angled it to capture the entire room. Then I left a clean, dust-free floor. I vacuumed every surface, double-checked that no mark remained when the room was spotless. I closed the door, turned off the lights, and forced myself to try and sleep. What I saw in the recording the next day made my blood run cold. The footage began normally showing an empty room bathed in darkness. Then hours later, flickers of static burst across the screen. The atmosphere in the video seemed to vibrate and shapes took form out of the shadows. They were indistinct, swirling pools of darkness that slid across the floor. Eventually, congregating in the center of the room, slow and deliberate, they almost seemed to merge into a single shape, human-like but never fully solid. I watched in horror as the shape bent down, dragging what looked like a finger or elongated limb across the floor. In confident strokes, my hand shook so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I could sense that it was aware of the camera's presence the way it occasionally paused, as if turning its featureless head to stare directly into the lens before it vanished. It scrolled a final sigil that glowed faintly on the floor, pulsing once before fading into the dust. Then, in a brief flicker of static, the figure was gone. That was enough. I decided I couldn't ignore the possibility that this thing was beyond my comprehension. Something sinister had chosen me, or more accurately, my creative work as a channel. Perhaps it craved the attention that my designs would bring. Each distorted image, each cryptic audio track was its way of seeping into other people's minds through my creations. My clients' nightmares, their descriptions of shadowy figures and ominous chanting were proof that it was succeeding. I resolved to rid myself of every design I had ever touched that displayed these alterations. I loaded external hard drives, memory sticks, and cloud folders with the corrupted files just to isolate them from my main system. Then I ran every security program I could find. My palms broke out in a cold sweat. My heart thumped so loudly it seemed to echo in the empty corridors of the house. Clearing out my portfolio felt like hacking off a diseased limb to save the rest of the body. Yet deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. That intangible presence had already made a home in my life, and a simple deletion of files wouldn't cast it out. I spent the following week fighting a creeping dread that followed me around like a scent. Even stepping into my office brought on waves of nausea, as if the room itself had turned against me. I repeatedly sensed a shape lurking just out of sight. So I stopped working in there altogether. I moved my computer to the living room, determined to leave that haunted space behind. Yet I couldn't bring myself to dispose of the office desk, the chair, the physical remnants of my daily routine. Part of me still clung to the hope that this was some sort of bizarre mental breakdown, and once I regained my stability, I could return to normal. That was when I noticed the symbols creeping into my sketches. Almost unconsciously, I was doodling in a notebook, trying to outline a fresh concept for a new client, safe physically away from the cursed home office, when I realized I had drawn a small, intricate emblem in the margin. My throat tightened when I recognized it as one of the sigils that had appeared in the dust. My heart raced so viciously that sweat broke along my forehead. I tried to rip the page out and tear it into pieces, but an intense trembling claimed my arms. As the fragments of paper fluttered to the floor, I felt an unsettling shiver pass through the room like a cold draft that came out of nowhere. That night I sat in silence, wrestling with the realization that this force had rooted itself inside my mind. It wasn't confined to the digital realm or even the physical space of my office. It was influencing my subconscious. Directing my hand even when I thought I was safe, I could no longer dismiss it as a series of coincidences or a delusion born of overwork. My sanity had become the battleground on which this presence staked its claim. I decided to face it in the only way I knew how. By acknowledging its hold on me, I stopped running from my own thoughts and instead let them run wild on an empty canvas by the flickering light of a single desk lamp. I spent hours sketching every symbol, every face, every distorted figure I had seen in my nightmares or in my altered designs. My heart pounded, my breathing ragged, but I couldn't stop. I sketched until my hands cramped, capturing every tormenting detail. In a frenzy of graphite and charcoal, the process felt both horrifying and strangely cathartic, as if I was ripping something malignant out of my brain and trapping it on paper. When the final symbol was drawn, the house went unnaturally quiet. No cacks, no hum from the fridge, no distant traffic. I sat there drenched in sweat, trying to steady my breathing. I had expected something dramatic, lights flickering or dark shapes erupting from the page, but nothing happened. Instead, I felt an overwhelming stillness, an anticipatory hush, as though the walls were holding their breath by morning. The sense of oppression had lessened, though a lingering chill remained in the air. I stored the sketches in a locked drawer, my heart still racing, but with a faint flicker of hope. Perhaps by confronting whatever had taken root in my psyche, I had robbed it of its secrecy, its power. I can't say I felt truly safe, but I did feel a subtle shift. The next time I checked my computer, I found no new distortions, no ancient scripts or chanting. Even the dust in the office seemed normal, yet I knew this might only be a temporary reprieve, a calm, before another storm. To this day, I don't know what exactly tried to emerge through my work. I can't say for certain if it left or merely lies dormant, waiting for a chance to resurface. Sometimes when I stare at a blank screen, I catch a glimpse of a shape in the reflection and feel the hairs on my arms rise. In warning, the memory of those symbols etched in dust still makes my heart pound. Whenever I recall the static-ridden figure bending over the floor, I feel nauseated, as if reliving that moment I've chosen not to destroy my sketches. Though the thought of them fills me with a mixture of dread and responsibility, it's my reminder that the barrier between creation and manifestation can be perilously thin, and so I remain watchful, continuing my work as best I can while staying vigilant for the slightest sign that the symbols have returned. It's a fragile piece, one that depends on my steady refusal to become a conduit for whatever lurks behind the veil. Sometimes I still feel that prickle on the back of my neck while I design. I grip my pen tighter, inhaling deeply to steady my pulse. My life now unfolds in the haze of a constant uneasy truce, haunted by the knowledge of what once slipped through and by the fear that it may someday break free again. Story 9. I first noticed something was wrong when I heard the metallic groan of the gate echo across my property in the dead of night. My neighborhood was usually quiet after sunset, and I had grown accustomed to the comforting hush of the surrounding houses that silence had become my evening companion until the gate violated it with its creaking. The sound sliced through the darkness, making me feel as though someone or something was announcing its unwelcome arrival. My pulse quickened. I had spent years studying electrical systems, and I couldn't explain how a device that was disconnected from the power supply could move on its own. I felt a chill in my stomach and immediate certainty that whatever was causing this had nothing to do with a simple malfunction. I stood there by my living room window watching the gate shutter against its hinges. Even though the overhead lights in the house were on the corners of each room felt darker than usual, my breathing grew shallow and I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to see if there was anyone lurking outside. My eyes strained to cut through the shadows, but I saw no sign of movement, just the gate swaying slightly as though it had a mind of its own. I began to sweat, my palms clammy. Every hair on my arms tingled in the cool air. The logical part of my brain insisted I investigate calmly. I was an engineer, after all. Machinery was my bread and butter. Electronics wires and intricate systems never intimidated me. Yet, the deeper I delved into the strangeness of what I was seeing, the more something primal crawled along my spine against all reason. I felt observed. The sensation made the back of my neck prickle. I found myself swallowing hard, adrenaline pumping through my veins, determined to maintain control. I forced myself to step outside with a flashlight. The gate was silent now, resting in place as if the earlier movement had been a figment of my imagination. Cautiously, I approached its motor box, kneeling down on the cold pavement. My fingers trembled a bit as I reached for the power cable. I confirmed it was still unplugged. The gate's power supply was definitely off, which made its previous motion all the more impossible. I recall standing there, the flashlight beam dancing across the metal of the motor unit as a slight breeze swirled the leaves around me. My breath left my lungs in anxious bursts. I started wondering if there had been some stored energy in the mechanism or maybe a glitch in the internal gear, but no plausible explanation came to mind that would justify its sudden activation. Each scenario I conjured was overshadowed by the simple fact that it had moved while disconnected. That reality alone was enough to make my skin feel damp with perspiration. I decided to ignore the unsettling event for the night, telling myself I would examine the wiring more closely in the morning. Yet I couldn't sleep every time I closed my eyes. My ears played tricks on me, imagined squeaks of metal, faint clanks, and the intrusive whisper of my own doubts. At around 3 in the morning, the gate began rattling again. This time, a sense of urgency seized my chest, my heart thudding so violently I could hear it in my eardrums. I jumped out of bed, flicked on the lights, and ran to the window. My stomach lurched when I recognized the pattern of the opening and closing. It was timed precisely. I stood by the window with a pen and notepad, tracing the pattern as best I could. My entire body was on edge, fingers shaking in time with my racing pulse. It was indeed repeating a sequence of short and long intervals, almost like a code. I remembered Morse code from my college days, so I scribbled down dots and dashes, each movement of the gate corresponding to a short or long mechanical, where the realization that the gate wasn't just malfunctioning but trying to communicate sank into my mind like a cold shard of fear. Once the sequence ended, I looked at my paper and confirmed it spelled out an address somewhere in the outskirts of town. My first instinct was to dismiss the entire thing. It was so irrational that I questioned my own sanity. Perhaps I had become overly tired or was succumbing to the power of suggestion. I tried to reassure myself that I was overanalyzing a random pattern, but as the gate shuttered a final time and settled with an ominous metal clang, I felt an unexplainable pull, as if it wanted me to follow its instructions. Over the next few days, the gate's behavior escalated. The movements became more frequent at random hours. Yet each time the intervals spelled out coherent words or addresses, each one predicting events before they happened. A few were benign, an upcoming thunderstorm or an unexpected phone call. but other messages hinted at bigger revelations with each cryptic phrase. I felt the tension coil tighter around my psyche like an invisible grip on my throat. Breathing became difficult whenever I suspected the gate was about to start one of its sessions. A dull ache formed in the back of my head. The stress and fear mounting, finally I caved. I followed one of the addresses the gate provided. Venturing out there felt like stepping into a nightmare. The location was a patch of open land about an hour's drive away, surrounded by tall grass and leaning fences. I saw nothing except a few rusted scraps of metal. Yet as I poked around with my flashlight, I discovered an ancient contraption half buried under the soil, a panel of gears and levers. Unlike anything I had seen in my engineering career, the metal was etched with strange markings, partially eroded but still discernible as a language or code far older than Morse. My heart hammered and cold sweat trickled down my back. A sense of dread enveloped me like I had unearthed something forbidden. I returned home with a gnawing sensation in my gut. My mind wouldn't settle. I felt an incessant need to find more of this strange technology. I started digging in my own backyard, guided by the repeated hints. The gate delivered at night the moment my shovel struck something metallic beneath the soil. A wave of nausea collided with my stomach. I paused, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts as I knelt in the dirt. My muscles tensed as if every cell in my body braced against an unseen threat. Digging deeper, I unearthed another portion of that bizarre mechanism, its gears glinting under the moonlight. It radiated a faint hum, a vibration I could feel through my shoes. My mouth went dry as I realized this apparatus was connected to a dimension beyond our own comprehension. I could feel the presence of something, some intelligence pulsing through it like a heartbeat. Every hair on my neck stood on end. If I pressed my hand against the exposed metal, my vision flickered as if my surroundings were shifting for a split second, revealing the silhouette of a world just beyond the veil of my own. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I was just exhausted and delirious, but I knew better in that moment. I glimpsed swirling shapes and shadows, a nauseating mismatch of landscapes that defied logic. It was as though I were peering through a porthole into a realm where geometry was unstable. My head spun and a wave of vertigo forced me to pull my hand away. My heart pounded violently against my ribcage and my skin felt clammy as if a fever had instantly seized me back in the house. I locked the doors and windows, even though I knew it was probably a futile gesture. The gate had become a conduit bridging the gap between my ordinary world and that hidden dimension. It no longer needed electricity to function. It seemed fueled by something else, something alive, I felt. Eyes everywhere as if intangible watchers had set their gaze upon me. When I sat at my desk to take notes, my hand shook uncontrollably. My pen scratched across the paper with frantic lines. My reflection in the window looked haunted. Disheveled hair. Eyes wide with sleepless fear. I tried to confide in a close friend over the phone, indirectly explaining I was dealing with a gate malfunction that hinted at deeper problems. They asked questions I could barely answer, but their skepticism was evident. My friend offered to visit, but I found myself making excuses to keep them away. I felt protective of my house for reasons I couldn't articulate. As soon as I hung up, I turned to see the gate trembling again as though it were eavesdropping and disapproved of external interference. An icy prickle shot down my spine and my breathing turned rapid shallow. I stared at it slow, methodical, swaying the mechanism, letting out a soft metallic moan that sounded like a warning. Each night the signals became more elaborate, my notepad filled with coded messages about other hidden relics, about unsuspecting occurrences near my property, and about the very nature of this new dimension. The house itself felt oppressive. Light bulbs flickered with no electrical cause. Footsteps echoed in empty rooms. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Dark shapes that vanished whenever I whirled around. My eyes ached from the constant strain of trying to detect what was real. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and cold metal. Sometimes I felt a brush against my arm or leg, only to discover there was nothing there. The fear lodged in my throat, choking me. My heart raced so fast it hurt. One night I caught a glimpse of something stepping through the gate as it slid open by itself. The figure was just a silhouette barely distinguishable in the darkness, my body seized with terror, and my pulse hammered in my temples. I couldn't discern its shape or features, only that it moved with unnatural grace. Its presence imposed a suffocating pressure on my chest. The gate then slammed shut, leaving me on my knees. In my hallway, gasping for air for hours, I sat with my back against the wall, mustering the courage to stand. Every second felt elongated, steeped in an unrelenting dread. Eventually, I forced myself back outside, determined to break whatever link had been established. I approached the half-buried mechanism in my backyard. My hand shook so violently it was hard to keep my grip on the flashlight. A maddening suspicion had taken hold of my thoughts. The contraption might be intentionally placed there to lure me deeper into its secrets. The oppressive weight of invisible watchers pressed against my mind, fueling a deep sense of paranoia. Sweat dripped down my forehead, stinging my eyes. But I refused to blink. I needed to see if anything moved in the darkness at the edge of the yard. The metal panel hummed softly as if beckoning me forward. Its strange etchings pulsed with a faint glow, taking a wrench from my toolbox. I tried to pry the thing loose from the ground the moment I applied pressure. A vibration shot up my arm. My head throbbed with a savage headache as though something was pushing back. Voices seemed to swirl in my mind. Distant and hollow, forming half-understood words. I reeled backward, nearly toppling over. My breath came in stuttering gasps, and I tasted copper in my mouth. I spat, trying to regain my balance. My heart pounded so fiercely that my vision spotted every instinct told me to run, but I stayed desperate to end the torment. Gradually, I managed to dismantle one of the outer plates beneath it. Was a labyrinth of cogs and circuits that defied any normal engineering. They didn't look built, but rather grown, merging flesh-like components with metal. My stomach lurched, and I struggled against the urge to retch as I reached out to touch a small gear that gleamed unnaturally. The gate on my driveway began to open and close in rapid succession like an alarm. I froze the code, hammered out a single word repeated over and over, stop summoning every ounce of determination. I ignored the command. I yanked the gear free with a violent jerk, feeling as though I were ripping an organ from a living body. My mind exploded with a barrage of disorienting images, swirling constellations, incomprehensible faces, and black corridors that stretched into infinity. My ears filled with a low, resonating hum, and my body convulsed as if electrocuted for a moment. I lost all sense of time and place. My mouth went dry, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I came to, I found myself hunched over the contraption, clutching that strange gear. The hum had ceased. The gate in the driveway was motionless, its metal frame silent. I took a few shaky steps back, expecting the silhouette to reappear or the contraption to reactivate at any moment. Instead, I felt the night air shift, releasing some of its suffocating heaviness. I managed to steady my breathing, gulping in lungfuls of the crisp air. My body trembled from exhaustion, but I felt an odd sense of triumph, an uneasy hope that maybe I had broken the link. In the following days, the gate remained still, no longer spelling out ominous predictions. The unnatural sense of being watched persisted, but it seemed weaker, as if the watchers were kept at bay, peering through a locked door. I kept the strange gear hidden in my garage, wrapped in multiple layers of cloth, always wary of any vibration it might emit. And although I tried to return to my routines, a haunted feeling lingered in every corner of my home. I could still taste the tang of adrenaline in the back of my throat, and my heartbeat never fully settled into a normal rhythm. Sometimes at night I stand by the window, staring at the gate in silence, half expecting it to open on its own accord and speak to me again. I struggle against the paranoia, reminding myself that I disconnected the mechanism's power once and for all. Yet I can't quell the nagging suspicion that the dimension I glimpse still casts its shadow over my reality. Each rustle of wind through the trees prompts my muscles to tense. Involuntarily, every creak of the floorboard sends a ripple of panic through my mind, conjuring visions of dark silhouettes, The boundary between my world and that other place remains fragile as though sealed with a brittle lock and key. I have no illusions about true safety anymore. The gate's silence feels like an uneasy truce rather than a victory in the back of my mind. A voice whispers that one day it will resume communicating or something else will. After all, I can still feel that low hum from time to time like a phantom frequency pulsing just beyond the range of human hearing. And whenever I walk past the gear hidden away in my garage, I sense that it knows I am there, that it remembers my touch. My life has become a cycle of standing guard and questioning my own experiences. While I haven't seen another message since that night, the tension in the air never fully dissipates. I remain here watching, waiting hard, pounding with every subtle noise. My single comfort is that I exposed whatever connection was forming and managed to tear it loose before it fully gained control. If that's even what happened, I still wake up sweating, half certain the gate is creaking open. My breath hitches at every unusual sound, and the fear that my reality could twist open at the seams never quite fades. Yet I keep going, forcing myself to live in the uncertainty that lingering dread might never dissolve. But at least I'm still here to face it. I can't say for sure if I won or if I merely delayed the inevitable, but in the silence that remains, I cling to the slightest hope that maybe if the gate moves again, I'll be better prepared to confront whatever stands on the other side. Story 10, the place felt wrong. The moment we pushed open the rusted door and stepped inside, it was as if the air itself recoiled at our presence, heavy with years of abandonment soaked in a dread I could feel pressing against my chest. The corridor stretched into darkness under flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed in and out of life. At the far end, a broken glass window let in a thin slice of moonlight, illuminating swirling mows of dust. Already my skin prickled with a clammy chill, and I could feel my heart pounding a little too fast for comfort, as though this building was warning us to turn around before we even began. I was the one who convinced the others to explore this abandoned commercial high-rise. It had been shut down years ago for reasons nobody in town could agree on. Some said it was due to structural hazards, others whispered rumors of illegal experiments or strange accidents. My friends Darren Ludia and Felipe tagged along, more out of a shared curiosity than any faith in ghost stories. We were just looking for a bit of excitement, something to break the monotony of our daily routines. But from the instant I set foot in that building, I realized this wouldn't be any sort of casual urban adventure. We started on the ground floor, shining our flashlights over peeling wallpaper, and scattered debris paint chips crackled under our shoes, and every step echoed into the silence. My breathing was shallow and my throat felt dry. No matter how often I swallowed, I kept telling myself it was just nerves, that I was overreacting, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was aware of us. Observing the corridor seemed to bend and stretch in ways that messed with my perspective, like a series of distorted reflections, an optical trick that made the hallway appear to expand and contract. As I moved, Darren was the most vocal, remarking how the building gave him the creeps, but insisting he would be fine. He used gallows humor, quietly joking that we might stumble upon squatters throwing a late-night party. Lucia rolled her eyes while Felipe remained mostly silent through my peripheral vision. I thought I saw flickers of movement around corners, but whenever I whipped my head to check, there was nothing. Eventually, we found the old elevator shaft. The door was jammed open, exposing a cavern of darkness where the elevator car should have been. The cable swayed gently as though disturbed by a light breeze that none of us could feel. We decided to take the stairs. Climbing the staircase was an unsettling journey. Each floor brought a subtle change in the air. It grew stale, musty, and then abruptly cold. The walls bore graffiti symbols I didn't recognize, and the overhead lights were either shattered or sputtering. We passed floor after floor in this near silence, occasionally punctuated by the sound of dripping water that echoed in the stairwell. After several flights, I started to question whether we were going in circles. My legs ached and my heart raced as if I'd been running uphill for miles. It felt like the entire building was pulsing around us, the temperature dropping bit by bit until my breath came out in small white clouds. Then we heard it, a distant thumping like the bass of loud music. It drifted down from the upper floors, accompanied by the vague murmur of many voices. It sounded like a celebration was taking place, as incongruous as that seemed in this deserted place. We paused to listen, exchanging uneasy glances. We moved toward the noise, curiosity mixed with an instinctual dread. With every step, the sound grew a little louder, like a party was in full swing just a few floors up. Eventually, the stairwell opened onto an expansive corridor leading to a wide set of double doors. They were slightly ajar, and colorful flickers like lights from a disco ball leaked around the edges. I felt my pulse in my throat. Part of me wanted to turn around and run, but an inexplicable pull drew me forward. We stepped through the doors into what looked like a ballroom. Moonlight filtered through dusty windows, and faint echoes of music seemed to vibrate in the walls. Yet the room itself was pitch dark and silent. No lights, no decorations, and certainly no guests. It was just four of us standing on a cracked marble floor, feeling colder than we had on the stairs the second we set foot inside that grand space. All our watches stopped in unison. I heard 3 sudden clicks and realized that mine had died as well. I tapped the face of my watch, but the second hand was frozen. The hush deepened, and the temperature dropped so fast that my teeth started chattering. We shone our flashlights on the walls and ceiling, searching for speakers or any sign of the sounds we had heard, but there was nothing. When I exhaled, the vapor hung in the air, swirling like a captive ghost. Before we could regroup, the doors behind us slammed shut. Darren rushed to yank them open, but they wouldn't budge, as if welded into the frame by a force we couldn't see. Lucia and Felipe tried to find another exit, running to the side doors and emergency exits, but each was either locked or barricaded. The entire ballroom had become a prison of darkness and ice. I noticed then that the windows along the far wall were shattered shards of glass littering the floor. Beyond the jagged openings, I expected to see the nighttime skyline, but all I saw was a limitless black void. It wasn't just darkness, there was a complete absence of anything. No city lights, no stars, no reflection of the moon. My stomach tightened and a wave of cold sweat spread across my body. My lungs felt restricted, like I was breathing underwater. I could smell something sharp in the air, a metallic tang that brought a surge of nausea. Felipe pointed a trembling finger at the broken glass scattered on the floor. Through the shards, I could see warped reflections of the 4 of us, but in those reflections, we were not just standing there. Each image showed a grotesque version of one of us engaged in unspeakable acts. One reflection depicted me, but my eyes were hollow. My mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong to any living thing I recognized. I appeared to be scrawling symbols in blood along the walls, lost in some eldritch trance. My heart pounded so hard that my vision blurred around the edges. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was like the image had me in a trance. By the time I tore my gaze from that warped mirror, I saw that Darren's reflection was performing some ritual, arms raised above his head, holding what looked like a small bowl of writhing black fluid. I forced myself to blink to breathe, reminding myself none of this could be real. But every rational thought evaporated under the relentless sense of dread that was filling my gut. The air was alive with menace, a presence that pressed in from all sides. We tried to regroup in the center of the ballroom, shining our flashlights in every direction. The beams flickered, my flashlight sputtered, and then died. I felt the darkness sink in, pressing against my retinas. The dim glow from Lucia's flashlight was all we had left, and it cast long, twisted shadows across the marble. She whispered that she could feel something brushing against her arm, though no. One was beside her. The rest of us felt it. 2 fleeting touches. Light tugging on sleeves, cold fingers grazing the back of the neck. Panic clawed at my throat, and I could barely keep my voice steady. I kept telling myself to focus, to find a way out. I recalled hearing that sometimes these old buildings had rooftop exits or external fire escapes. If we could just get up another floor, maybe we could reach the roof. I suggested this plan, half expecting the others to dismiss it. Instead, they nodded in tense agreement, anything to escape the oppressive grip of this freezing ballroom. We found a side corridor that led to another stairwell, only to discover the metal door. Jammed, Darren and I put our shoulders into it, forcing it to move a fraction of an inch, while Lucia and Felipe kept watch behind us with one concerted push. We managed to open it enough to slip through. The stairwell was just as dark and frigid as the ballroom. Our breath echoed against the concrete walls, accompanied by a persistent faint scraping noise. It reminded me of nails against stone, or perhaps a distant scratching from within the structure itself. Moving upward, each step felt like a small victory against the therming dread in my veins. My legs shook and my breath came out in ragged gasps. My heart hammered in my chest so loud I wondered if the others heard it. The cold seeped through my jacket and into my bones, and rivulets of sweat trickled down my spine, making the chill even more unbearable. Every so often we would stop at a landing, aiming our single remaining flashlight into the gloom. The swirling dust and faint reflections in broken windows teased the edges of our vision, with more impossible sights, distorted forms dancing in the glass-twisted shapes that disappeared the moment we tried to focus on them. At one point, Darren let out a muffled exclamation, his voice trembling. He seemed to think he heard echoes from behind the walls, distant chanting interspersed with muffled moans. He kept saying it sounded like us, like the four of us repeating phrases we couldn't understand. None of us dared to verify his claim. There was no way to confirm or deny it. Without risking what little sanity we had left, we reached another floor that seemed large enough to house offices or storage rooms. The hallway lights here flickered weakly, giving us a murky yellow glow that was somehow even more unsettling than total darkness. The paint on the walls was chipped and peeling in long strips, revealing layers of older paint beneath a rank odor clung to the air, reminiscent of stale chemicals and something else I couldn't identify. My nostrils flared and I fought back an urge to gag. Each breath tasted foul and my eyes stung as though exposed to pungent fumes. We ventured into the hallway, passing broken doors and smashed windows. I looked at the scattered glass on the floor, avoiding direct glances at the reflective surfaces. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing my hideous doppelganger again, enthralled by some nightmare ritual. The corridor seemed to stretch forever, the overhead lights blinking at irregular intervals. Each time it went dark, I felt an irrational fear that when the lights came back on, I'd be alone. My pulse thundered in my ears and my throat felt parched, as if I'd been sprinting for miles. In the dim flicker of one of the lights, we saw a door marked maintenance. It looked relatively intact, and we hoped it might lead to a roof access or at least some alternative route out. The door was heavy, and it took our combined effort to swing it open. Inside was a cramped utility room with a ladder leading upward through a gaping hole in the ceiling. A faint gust of cold night air drifted down, mingled with the stale aroma of ancient dust. My heart pounded at the sight of what could be an escape. Without much discussion, we decided to climb. Darren went first, and I followed closely, feeling the ladder rattle under our combined weight. My hands were slick with sweat, despite the cold, making it hard to keep a grip on the metal rungs. Every inch we ascended, the air grew sharper, biting at my exposed skin. The only source of illumination was Lucia's flashlight from below, its feeble beam casting quivering shadows that danced across the rough concrete walls. As I emerged through the hole in the ceiling, I found myself on a narrow rooftop. The skyline was visible, but it looked warped, as though the city had been replaced by a labyrinth of twisted buildings. Nothing was where it should have been. My vision seemed to pulsate, the edges of the structures vibrating with an otherworldly haze. I tasted copper in my mouth, and my breathing became ragged, as if the atmosphere were thinner. Here, the four of us gathered on that uneven rooftop, scanning for a fire escape or some route to the streets below. I remember feeling a wave of relief, however small, that we were out of that stifling interior, but the relief was short-lived. The swirling black void we had seen through the broken windows below lingered in the corners of my peripheral vision. If I looked directly at the cityscape, it almost seemed normal, just dark and desolate. But from the corner of my eye, I could see shapes moving unnaturally, as if entire blocks were shifting or morphing. A deep paranoia rooted in my mind, telling me we might not be truly outside, that the building itself was warping reality around us. My heart pounded in my ears and my limbs felt weak. I thought for a moment I might pass out, the cold sweat soaking my clothes. The others looked equally shaken. I told myself we needed to keep going, that somewhere along the perimeter of this rooftop, we might find an actual fire escape moving in a tight group. We edged along the crumbling ledge. The wind whipped at our faces, stinging our eyes and numbing our cheeks. Then we saw it, a narrow metal staircase bolted to the side of the building. It looked precarious, but it was our best chance. One by one, we eased onto the stairs, making our way downward. The sounds from inside the building seemed to follow us. Faint echoes of that non-existent party insane chanting and the dull thrum of bass. It was as if the walls were alive, sending out mocking illusions to lure us back in when my feet finally touched solid ground. In an alley behind the building, my knees buckled with relief. The others emerged soon after, equally shaken. The building loomed above us like a silent sentinel. Windows shattered, walls marred by decades of neglect for a split second. I caught a reflection in one of the remaining windows, a twisted version of myself standing in the ballroom eyes. Pitch black, wearing a grin that made my stomach turn. I had to tear my eyes away, my pulse hammering in my ears. No one spoke for a long time. We just stood there in the alley, breath steaming in the cold night, hearts pounding. We were beyond explanation or logic. The only coherent thought in my mind was that we had gotten out. I suspected none of us would ever talk about what exactly we saw in those reflections. Even Darren, who had been the boldest, stared at the ground. Trembling Lutia and Felipe looked like they were lost in their own private nightmares, caught in loops of replayed terror. Eventually, we gathered ourselves enough to slip back onto the main street. Storefronts were closed and the streetlights were dim, but it still felt like an entirely different world. One that was stable where I could trust my senses, yet I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that something from that building still clung to us. My skin felt raw, and when I inhaled, the air tasted wrong. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of movement and shiny surfaces. A car window, a puddle, a polished metal door, like the distorted versions of us were still watching, waiting for a moment to drag us back into that forsaken maze. Back at home, I stared into my bathroom mirror, half expecting to see another monstrous reflection. I was exhausted, body shaking with deep tremors, stomach churning with residual nausea. My heartbeat refused to slow to a normal rhythm, and my thoughts spun. Part of me feared I might wake up back in that freezing ballroom. Another part was terrified that I would never wake up at all when I finally lay down. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the building breathing around me. I'd jerk awake, gasping for air, throat tight that night. And every night since, my dreams have been filled with the echo of a party that never happened. Music that trails just out of earshot, and the chilling image of a reflection not quite my own. I know the others feel it too, though we try to reassure one another that it was just our imaginations. None of us truly believes it. We caught a glimpse of something vast and malignant lurking behind the veneer of reality, and there's no forgetting the way that building seemed to come alive, feeding on our terror, warping our reflections into vile mockeries of ourselves. I don't know what that commercial high-rise really was, a cursed structure, a gateway to something indescribable, or just a place where reality frays at the edges. But I do know it changed me. Even in the safety of my own home, I can feel the old fear creeping in whenever I pass a dark corridor or glimpse my reflection in a mirror. The memory of that freezing ballroom, our stopped watches, and the horrifying images in the broken glass lingers in the back of my mind, gnawing at my sanity, reminding me how fragile our hold on reality can be. I escaped, yet a part of me never truly left that oppressive chill. The shadows dancing in the corner of my sight, and the knowledge that somewhere just out of reach, there's a reflection of me doing unspeakable things. It all remains, and that is the worst horror of all. Knowing that in some cracked piece of glass in some forgotten hallway, there's a version of me still lost in the dark, rewriting the story of my life into a nightmare with no exit. Story 11. I still remember the first time I noticed a presence lingering behind me. The studio lights were dimmed for dramatic effect, and the space felt cramped with shadows that seemed to stretch far beyond their natural boundaries. My heart thumped irregularly in my chest, and I strained my eyes to check if the gloom in the corner was just my imagination, though I attempted to dismiss it as a trick of poor lighting and overworked nerves. Something inside me recoiled as if touched by an invisible hand. That was the moment an unspoken fear began to gnaw at the back of my mind, whispering that whatever stood in the darkness was not merely shadow, but something far more malignant. I'm a freelance photographer by trade, always hopping from one rented studio to another, chasing the next fashion shoot or product campaign. I prided myself on adaptability, on being able to transform any dingy warehouse or cramped basement into a workable, even creative environment. But no matter how many times I changed locations, the sense of being watched never left. It started as a prickling at the nape of my neck, as if charged static clung to the air. My breathing would grow shallow and quick, and a thin layer of perspiration would coat my palms. I'd catch myself glancing repeatedly over my shoulder, convinced there was a figure just at the periphery of my vision, someone or something waiting patiently for me to drop my guard. In the early days, the strange occurrences remained slight enough that I could chalk them up to anxiety or stress. I made excuses: too much caffeine, irregular sleep, the usual hustle of a creative career. But as the weeks wore on, the unsettling moments escalated from subtle to undeniable. The first concrete evidence came during a product shoot. I was photographing a vase of flowers for a small boutique. When I reviewed the digital images, there was a faint, hazy silhouette behind the arrangement, a shape that looked almost human but had no discernible features at the time. I dismissed it as a problem with the camera's sensor, maybe some dust or lens flare, yet a cold ache spread through my chest. The more I studied that silhouette, feeling as though a pair of eyes stared back at me from behind the screen. Soon after, clients started complaining about feeling ill. A makeup artist reported pounding headaches and nausea. After standing in front of my lens, a model said her throat felt tight and her energy drained for hours after the shoot. Barely able to hold herself upright, one person even mentioned that upon returning home, all the plants in their living room drooped and wilted within a single day. This raised an eyebrow, though I was reluctant to believe my camera had anything to do with it. The more I tried to rationalize these symptoms, the more bizarre coincidences piled up. Then I noticed the same nebulous outline appearing in nearly every new set of photos. As I moved to different studios, the shape followed. The faint figure seemed to become clearer and more defined each time, hovering like a grim phantom in the margins of each composition. My nights became haunted by nightmares. I'd wake drenched in cold sweat, heart pounding so fiercely I could feel my pulse echo in my wrists. Sleep turned into a dreaded necessity. Rather than a reprieve in these dreams, I wandered through endless corridors of mirrors, each reflecting that same ominous figure. When I tried to run, my lungs seized up and my muscles burned with crippling fatigue. I couldn't escape the image or the profound dread that came with realizing this thing was real, not merely a figment of my imagination. Eventually, I came to a critical realization. All the oddities started after I'd attended a peculiar auction. I'd been sent to photograph antiques for a catalog, a routine assignment that forced me to shadow the auctioneers and gather promotional shots. One item in particular caught my attention: a large ornate mirror with a tarnished silver frame. My recollection of photographing it was oddly hazy, as though the moment itself had been lost to a dense fog. Yet I remembered experiencing a sudden chill when my flash bounced off the mirror's surface. The reflection had seemed deeper than normal, almost bottomless. Like peering into a dark well, my fingers had trembled, and a sharp pain lanced behind my eyes. Determined to power through, I took a few more shots and then avoided looking at that mirror again. But once I started examining my files at home, I noticed something unusual in those pictures: a swirling distortion behind the glass. It was like capturing the image of a black hole or a tear in reality from that point on. I suspect I unwittingly unleashed whatever now followed me. My sense of guilt grew oppressive, a weight pressing on my chest each time I saw that silhouette. It grew bolder with each shoot, somehow feeding off the living subjects I placed in front of my lens. My photography equipment felt tainted, as though every time I pressed the shutter button, I was inviting this presence to siphon vitality from its unsuspecting victims. By then, I began to realize how truly isolated I was in this terror, though I tried confiding in a couple of close colleagues. They mostly dismissed my story or attributed my concerns to overwork. One person suggested I take a break. Another gave me the name of an alternative medicine practitioner, hoping it was just a case of anxiety. Their well-meaning but ultimately dismissive advice left me feeling more alone than ever. Out of sheer desperation, I started analyzing my photos in excruciating detail. I blew up the images to absurd magnifications, scrutinizing every pixel of that shape. The silhouette, once just a smudge, had begun to reveal contorted limbs and something that resembled a ragged face. The lines of its form radiated with an unsettling energy, like black lightning branching off into the background. My heartbeat drummed in my ears each time I studied it, and sometimes I couldn't bear to look for more than a few seconds without feeling nauseous. Worse yet, when I showed these high-resolution prints to another photographer, he claimed he saw nothing unusual, just a mild artifact or banding in the gradient. But the hair on my arm stood up and my skin crawled. Whenever I stared at it, something was there, and its gaze was fixed squarely on me. New, more alarming manifestations occurred during a portrait session in a cramped basement studio. The overhead lights began flickering erratically. Each flash of light revealed that shape in a different corner of the room, making it seem as if it was moving in short, jarring increments. My breath grew shallow and cold. Sweat trickled down my back. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped my camera. The subject, a friend modeling a casual clothing line, mentioned afterward that the entire place felt off and that he'd never experienced such a severe migraine in his life. I pretended to laugh it off, but my insides churned, wrung tight by a sensation of foreboding that refused to leave me. By this point, the boundaries between reality and delirium began to blur. The oppressive aura that dogged me seeped into my everyday life. I'd sense movement in my peripheral vision while cooking, only to whip around and find nothing but empty air. My phone would glitch out randomly, showing black screens that flickered with faint humanoid outlines. The nightmares escalated into full-blown night terrors, sometimes accompanied by sleep paralysis. I would wake up pinned to my mattress by an unseen weight, my lungs strangled by invisible hands in the corner of my dim bedroom. I'd spot that silhouette watching. Waiting the moment I could move again, I would bolt upright, gasping for breath, heart hammering so forcefully I thought I'd pass out. I decided to revisit the auction house to learn more about the mirror I'd photographed. I arrived unannounced, half crazed with exhaustion, but determined to find answers indirectly. I managed to glean from an auction coordinator that the mirror had been part of a private estate, rumored to have some unusual energy. Though the details were vague and couched in uncertain, half-embarrassed terms, my contact refused to say more, avoiding any formal acknowledgement that something might have been sinister about the piece. Yet I left the conversation with an uncomfortable sense of validation, as if I'd peeled back a thin layer of secrecy only to find rotted earth beneath. In a desperate attempt to protect myself and protect others from further harm, I resolved to track down the mirror itself. I discovered it had been purchased by a collector who stored it in a suburban storage facility. After a series of tense inquiries and near pleading requests, I was allowed a brief visit to photograph it again. Under controlled conditions, the collector didn't believe in any curse, but let me approach the item with caution, stepping into the storage unit. I felt a stagnant heaviness in the air, as though I'd entered a chamber with no oxygen. My skin tingled and my breath grew ragged. There, draped in a dusty sheet, stood that mirror even before I pulled back the fabric. My knees felt weak, a sense of raw, primal dread coiled in my stomach, like a serpent poised to strike when I lifted the sheet. My reflection seemed fractured in the silver frame. The glass looked tarnished and dark, but not in the usual way. Old mirrors appear. It felt almost predatory, as though it hungered for my gaze. My own face stared back pallid and drenched in sweat, but behind me, indistinct and looming, was the entity. This time it didn't appear as a faint suggestion. It was vivid, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. My stomach flipped and a sharp chill traveled from the base of my spine up to my neck. I sensed that if I stood there any longer, something irreversible would happen, like the final snap of a trap closing in my panic. I tried covering the mirror again, stumbling backward in the cramped unit. My vision blurred and the overhead fluorescent light seemed to flicker. The air grew unbearably thick, rattling with a low hum that made my eardrums ache for a moment. I thought I heard whispering, not with my ears, but inside my skull, as though the entity had found a direct link to my mind. I forced myself to concentrate on a single objective: contain the mirror, somehow disrupt the connection that had formed when I first photographed it. I managed to drape the sheet back over the reflective surface, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped the fabric. The humming sound diminished to a faint buzz, and the suffocating dread receded enough for me to regain my breath. The collector seemed puzzled by my urgency, but did not protest when I suggested locking the mirror away, sealing it under heavy tarps, and storing it in an interior compartment away from light. My only piece of direct speech during that tense exchange was a request to ensure that no one attempted to remove the covers again. The collector, though skeptical, complied. Though I left the storage facility with my heart still thudding and my nerves frayed, I felt a strange sense of relief. Over the following days and weeks, my photos appeared free of that hazy silhouette. My client stopped reporting. Strange ailments, plants remained healthy, and the persistent nightmares gradually subsided into more manageable flashes of unease. Still, an underlying anxiety kept me from feeling fully safe. I continued to move studios, but that smothering sensation of being watched lessened like a slowly diminishing echo. Months passed, and I dared to believe I had escaped the worst of it. Yet a subtle fear always loomed at the back of my mind. The knowledge that the mirror still existed somewhere in that storage unit, locked away. Yes, but not destroyed. My nightmares now revolve around the possibility of it being rediscovered by someone curious, or worse, by someone as clueless as I once was, someone who might snap a photograph without understanding the consequences. No one died, no dramatic final confrontation took place, and I never witnessed anyone collapsing outright from this entity. But I can't shake the nagging sense that I only postponed its influence, like trapping a venomous serpent in a flimsy cage on quiet evenings when the shadows stretch long across the floor and the soft hum of appliances takes on an eerie quality. I still feel a faint presence brush against my consciousness. My pulse quickens and my palms grow slick with each of these episodes. A question tolls in my head: if something so malevolent can be half unleashed by a single photograph. What else lurks behind the reflective surfaces of our ordinary world? Even now, long after I sealed that ancient mirror, I keep my camera locked away. When not in use, I avoid photographing mirrors or anything that could act as a gateway for that monstrous presence, but the memory lingers sometimes in the darkest hours. I think I hear the low whisper of that entity's voice, or is it just the wind outside my window? My rational mind insists it's just paranoia, yet my pounding heart refuses to believe that all is well. Somewhere in the corner of my vision, in that half-light between waking and sleep, I can almost see a ragged outline flickering, waiting for me to let my guard down. Every so often I look over past work shots from before I ever attended that ill-fated auction. They're just normal pictures, entirely free of distortion or malevolence. Yet I study them with a tightness in my chest, aware of how easily my life was upended by a single click of a shutter. I can't erase what happened, nor can I truly reveal it to others without sounding unhinged. My only consolation is that by sealing away that mirror, I may have contained the horror from spreading further, and in those final moments before sleep claims me. Each night I brace myself for the possibility that the shape might return, perhaps through some reflection I overlooked: a window, a pool of water, a gleaming doorknob. I swallow hard, feeling my heartbeat skitter as if warning me that the nightmare never really ended. I press my back against the mattress, eyes flickering across the darkened ceiling, and I wait. The silence is deafening. No words, no footsteps, no direct confrontation. But I know it's there, just outside my line of sight, biding its time. Eager for the next chance to slip through a lens and devour the living essence from whomever stumbles across its path. I haven't beaten it. I've only bought myself a temporary reprieve, and that knowledge is enough to keep me awake. Heart-hammering breath, uneven cold sweat trickling down my forehead, staring wide-eyed into the looming shadows that threatened to swallow me. Whole story, 12, I could feel the hush of the ancient cemetery. Long before I stepped inside its iron gates, the wind seemed to avoid this place as though it too feared to disturb the rows of crumbling tombstones. A brittle layer of dead leaves crunched under my shoes, and each step echoed unnaturally in the silent night. The darkness here was different, heavier, almost tangible, creeping across my skin like icy fingertips. My heart hammered louder than it ever had, and I remember pausing under the arched entrance, wondering if I should turn back. It was too quiet, too cold, and something about that gnarled oak tree near the far edge of the cemetery seemed wrong. But the strangest part was the flicker of two glowing eyes. Watching me from behind one of the oldest markers, a black cat silently staring, as though it had been expecting me all along. I had come to this cemetery on a misguided whim. The legend of an enchanted watchman was the talk of a few local enthusiasts, and something about it caught my curiosity. Looking back, I was naive. I didn't believe in curses or ghosts, and I had convinced myself I would be in and out in a matter of minutes just to soothe my restlessness. Instead, the moment I saw that cat, my stomach twisted into knots of dread. It perched on a marble headstone so weathered that its inscription was nearly impossible to read, and it kept its gaze fixed on me. Unblinking, the cat's eyes glowed with an intensity that defied the dim moonlight. Already I sensed I was in the presence of something not quite natural. Despite my apprehension, I tried to ignore the cat and navigate the narrow paths winding between gravestones as I walked. A strange static seemed to build in the air. My ears caught faint rustling sounds, almost like whispers flitting just out of range, blending with the night breeze. I thought perhaps it was just my nerves. My pulse beat a relentless staccato under my skin, and my breath came in shallow bursts. Dampness beaded at my hairline and clung to my back. Every so often I glanced over my shoulder, convinced that the cat was following me, but when I looked, it was never there, at least. Not in the spot I expected. Sometimes I would see a pair of glowing eyes on a distant tombstone. Other times I saw them from a shadow by the gate. I decided I'd had enough. There was a suffocating quality to the darkness that made me feel as though it was slowly closing in. My heart pounded harder with each step as I tried to retrace my path toward the exit. That was when I first heard the quick shuffle of feet that weren't mine. A jolt of panic shot up my spine. Someone else was there, hidden among the tombstones. Before I could do more than tense my muscles, a figure emerged and lunged at me, pinning me against a tilted grave marker. I couldn't see the person's face clearly, but I felt the pressure of a forearm against my throat and heard a threatening command hiss near my ear. My entire body shook, and for a second I felt my vision blur with terror. It was then I noticed the cat again, this time with absolute certainty. It sprang from a nearby crypt tail, lashing, letting out a low, guttural growl that I'd never heard come from a feline before. Its eyes flared, their eerie gleam slicing through the darkness. My attackers stiffened. Even in my dazed confusion, I could sense that this cat was not normal. There was a moment of hesitation from the assailant, as though they felt the same unnatural aura that radiated off the creature. Before I understood what was happening, the cat vaulted toward the attacker's head with a chilling hiss, and I felt the weight against me loosen. I pushed the person away and scrambled to my feet. By the time I looked back, the black cat was perched on the ground, its body tense, tail slashing at the air like a whip. My attacker seemed equally terrified of the cat, of me, or of something else entirely. They stumbled backward, muttered a curse under their breath, and disappeared into the night. The echo of their retreating footsteps trailed off, leaving me alone once more with my racing heartbeat and that strange black cat. A part of me wanted to run to leave that unnatural place and never look back, but a peculiar sense of gratitude and awe made me linger. The cat turned its gaze on me, and I swear my blood turned to ice. Its eyes were mesmerizing and unsettling, as if aware of every secret tucked away in my mind. I was overcome by a sudden wave of vertigo, forcing me to lean against a headstone to steady myself. Then, with calm deliberation, the cat approached Woe around my ankles and blinked slowly. Despite my trembling, I felt oddly reassured, like I was in the presence of a guardian. I whispered shaky thanks to the cat, though the words sounded pathetic. Even to me, I had no rational explanation for what had just happened, so I numbly made my way toward the cemetery's gate. Every nerve in my body wound tight. The cat followed at a distance, never losing sight of me until finally we both emerged onto the deserted street. It was only then that I realized how silent the outside world had become. Not a car engine or a distant conversation, just the faint hum of streetlights overhead, and my own ragged breathing by the time I arrived at my apartment. The cat was still there watching. I live alone in a small place on the edge of the city. I unlocked my door hands trembling so badly it took me 3 tries to fit the key in. Once inside, I turned to see if the cat would remain outside, but it slipped past my legs with uncanny agility. I didn't even attempt to stop it. Something told me this was inevitable. The cat explored, sniffing at the furniture in corners as though it owned the place. My skin still prickled from the remnants of fear, but I couldn't bring myself to banish the cat. It had saved me after all. Or had it been coincidence, my exhausted mind couldn't make sense of it. That night, I tossed and turned in bed, haunted by half-remembered nightmares where I was lost in endless graves. Black cats circling me around midnight. The boards in the living room creaked. I felt a surge of tension coil in my stomach. My mouth went dry and my heart thumped so violently that my entire body vibrated with each beat. I tried to steady my breathing, but the more I listened, the louder that faint rustle became. With slow caution, I crept out of bed, the sweat turning cold on my skin. There in the dim light cast by a flickering lamp, the cat stood upright on its back legs. My mind struggled to process the image. It looked bigger than before, almost as tall as a short adult with elongated limbs and a neck that appeared slightly too long. For a moment, it was neither fully cat nor fully human, some twisted hybrid that made my pulse hammer in raw terror. My eyes stung with disbelief, and I wanted to cry out, but my voice caught in my throat, tangled in dread. The creature noticed me and held my gaze slowly. It circled the room, scratching symbols into the floor with sharp claw-like fingertips. It moved with deliberate concentration as though performing a solemn rite. The faint smell of sulfur filled my nostrils. My temples pounded and my hands trembled uncontrollably. I felt like I was watching something forbidden. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I couldn't move. My body was glued to the spot by a primal, paralyzing fear. After it finished carving the shapes, the creature pressed its long fingers over them and a faint glow pulsed. I heard a series of whispers. At first I thought it was my own voice, but the words were distinctly different, layered and ancient sounding as abruptly as it had started. The glow faded and the cat, once more in its smaller form, stepped away from the strange markings. It was as if the transformation had drained its energy. It sat panting softly, regarding me with what I can only call an expression of careful concern. I realized then that this thing wasn't threatening me, it was protecting me, but from what for the next few days my life twisted into a labyrinth of anxiety and confusion. Odd phenomena began to follow me everywhere. Electronic devices fizzled out. Strange shadows flickered in my peripheral vision, and on more than one occasion I caught a glimpse of the cat in 2 places at once. I would see it lounging on the windowsill, then turn a corner and find it in the kitchen at the exact same moment. The physical reactions never eased every time it happened. My heart would pound, my skin would break out in cold sweat, and a tremor would run through my arms. My sense of reality began to slip. My nights were even worse. The cat, or rather that hybrid shape it took, performed its bizarre rituals throughout the apartment, inscribing protective sigils on the walls and muttering incantations in a voice just low enough to be incomprehensible. The scratching of its claws on the wooden boards became a lullaby of dread that kept me suspended on the edge of sanity. I barely slept. Nightmares bled into waking visions. I started hearing the echo of faint bells as though from some distant place whenever the cat performed its rites. Eventually, I forced myself to gather clues. I examined one of the symbols it had carved into my table, a looping design with archaic letters around it. Using the internet and some old occult references, I matched it to an ancient script that belonged to a forgotten cult, said to guard humanity from malevolent forces beyond our understanding. My hand shook so badly while reading these references that I nearly dropped my phone. Something about guardians of the hidden gate kept coming up in order that existed to maintain a balance between our realm and a darker reality. It sounded nonsensical, but it matched the cat's behavior disturbingly well. A growing paranoia took hold. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind or if some cosmic secret had invaded my life. Without my consent, my neighbors seemed to sense something off about me. They'd give me strange looks in the hallway, and occasionally I overheard them whisper among themselves, speculating about the bizarre noises from my unit. At odd hours, my heart raced. Whenever I stepped outside, convinced I was being watched by more than just curious neighbors, I saw shapes in the corner of my vision, elongated silhouettes that vanished when I spun around, leaving me soaked in sweat and shivering from a dread I couldn't name. One evening, the cat-human creature quietly approached me in the living room. I was slumped on the couch, haunted by the swirl of questions in my mind. Without speaking a word aloud, it communicated through a series of gestures and an unsettling mental pressure, as if images were being imprinted onto my thoughts. I perceived glimpses of robed figures standing in a circle, chanting in front of a towering gate carved from black stone. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would bruise my ribs. I felt a crushing weight on my chest, and my breaths came in ragged, shallow bursts. The images were too vivid, too precise to dismiss as a mere hallucination. Gradually, I understood that I had been chosen, marked in a sense, by this ancient order that the cat represented. I grasped that my accidental encounter in the cemetery had been no accident at all. The cat was a sentinel, and I was now part of some lineage of guardians. The weight of this realization pressed down on me like a giant hand. I staggered to my feet, trying to swallow the dryness in my mouth. Fear pounded through my veins, but beneath it was an awful sense of responsibility. My entire body tingled with an energy both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. From that point on, the cat's protective rituals took on a frantic urgency. Every night it scrolled. More inscriptions traced complex patterns with candle wax and burned pungent herbs that left the air so thick it was hard to breathe. I witnessed shadows at the windows, shadows in the shape of large misshapen figures that defied reason. Some part of me believed they were the threat the cat was warding off. My blood ran cold whenever I heard scraping sounds at the door or a window rattle as though tested by unseen hands. My heart would spike and I'd break out in a clammy sweat, cowering behind the creature as it hissed at the intrusions. I wondered if my life had been irreversibly pulled into a realm I was never meant to know about. There were moments I lost trust in everything around me. Every flickering light bulb could have been a sign, every mirror reflection a door to some impossible dimension. The worst was the creeping paranoia that maybe I wasn't fully human anymore. Maybe by witnessing these rituals and connecting with this cat, I was being transformed on a level I couldn't perceive at last on a particularly suffocating night. The cat prepared another ritual. It set candles in a circular pattern around me. I noticed my hand shaking so violently that I had to clasp them together just to keep from collapsing. A deep thrumming filled the room like the resonance of a distant drum. My vision blurred at the edges and cold sweat trickled down my temples. The cat's form began shifting once more, limbs elongating torso, contorting until it resembled some unholy hybrid of person and beast. My lungs struggled to draw air as it began chanting in that guttural, indecipherable language. A swirling gust of air whipped around the room, snuffing out the candles one by one, until only the single flame behind the cat remained. I felt an invisible barrier peel away from me as though I had been standing behind a veil of ignorance. All my life, for a few heart-stopping moments, I saw the cat creature's true visage, an ageless guardian marked by eons of mystical tradition bearing the weight of countless generations of watchers. Its eyes glowed with an almost sorrowful knowledge. Then it pressed its hands to the floor, and I felt a surge of energy erupt, blasting through the apartment windows, rattled so loudly I feared they would shatter my ears. Rang, and the vibrations resonated through my bones. When the tumult died down, I found myself alone on the living room floor, panting, drenched in sweat. My heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. The cat was gone, or so I thought. At first, I then noticed it once again in its simple feline form, perched on the windowsill. It regarded me with quiet intensity, as though evaluating whether I had the strength to accept what I was becoming. In the aftermath of that final rite, something changed. A burden seemed to lift from the walls. The sense of being watched by malevolent forces receded. The protective inscriptions etched into my apartment appeared to fade, leaving faint burn marks that carried a residual tang of incense. My arms trembled with a combination of relief and lingering adrenaline. I felt the dryness in my mouth ease, and I forced myself to breathe deeply, but any sense of triumph was overshadowed by a knowing realization. I was bound to this creature and the ancient order it represented. I had been chosen to stand guard against horrors I could barely comprehend. The cat hasn't left me since it remains a silent companion, sometimes napping in a sunbeam like any ordinary pet, other times appearing at my side when I least expect it, its presence a continuous reminder of the path I must follow. People often ask why I seem so jumpy. They notice the faint scars on my wooden floors and the strange carvings I haven't bothered to remove. I offer them vague explanations. I suspect they believe I've succumbed to eccentricities, or perhaps they think I'm suffering from some lingering trauma. In truth, I know an unspoken war is being waged just beyond their perception, and so I sit here now late at night with the cat's glowing eyes studying me from across the room. There is a tension coiled in my chest that will never fully loosen. I'm awake while the rest of the world sleeps, haunted by a constant awareness that something out there lurks in the shadows, testing the boundaries of my newfound responsibility. My hands still tremble if I think about the cemetery or that first terrifying night in the apartment. My reflection in the mirror sometimes looks unfamiliar, as though a sliver of whatever magic coursed through the cat has begun to reflect in me. I don't know if I can run from this destiny. Not that I truly want to. Some primal instinct warns me that those who try to flee this calling meet fates worse than any rational mind could endure, so I remain here waiting, bracing myself for the next ripple of terror that will brush against my consciousness. My survival feels tenuous, as though balanced on the edge of a blade, but I cling to a faint hope that this legacy will guide me, that I will find a way to stand against the darkness. And each night when the cat's silhouette appears in my hallway, impossibly tall, and I feel that electric charge on my skin, I'm reminded that I am no longer the man I once was. I have seen too many things that defy explanation. My heart will never again beat as calmly as it did before. I stepped foot in that cemetery. Now I am marked as a guardian of something I barely understand, and the cat with its otherworldly eyes ensures I will not abandon my place. Even if I tried, the claws of fate have already sunk in too deep. All I can do is endure and remain vigilant in the darkness that grows thicker by the hour. The cat stands watch at my side, silent and patient, its gaze forever fixed beyond the veil, daring any lurking terror to cross the threshold again. My dreams are a torrent of runes and chanting, and my waking hours are an exercise in grappling with the impossible. There is no simple escape from this reality. Yet if there's any comfort in this twisted bond, it is knowing that I do not face the unknown alone. The cat is there, older than reason, and for now that must be enough to keep the horrors at bay. I'm left with the uneasy truth that I've inherited a cosmic responsibility, an unearthly guardianship that shows no sign of releasing its hold, and the tension in my bones. The awareness behind my eyes will never let me forget what I have become. Story 13. I remember the first time I heard it. I was standing under the warm rush of the shower, letting the steam envelope me in a moment of solitary comfort. Then, slicing through the hiss of water, I caught the faint sound of someone whispering my name. I froze, blood pounding so hard I felt it in my temples. For a split second, my breath snagged in my throat, my heart hammered in my chest, and I strained my ears to decipher if the sound was real or just a product of my overactive imagination. But the voice, so soft, so deliberate, felt more real than the hot drops splashing against my shoulders. That was the moment I realized something had found me. even within the supposed sanctity of my own home. I live alone in an old craftsman-style house tucked away at the end of a quiet street lined with ancient oaks. Usually I enjoy the silence. My job as a writer demands hours upon hours of undisturbed solitude. The battered hardwood floors creak with each step, and the walls are thick enough to block out most outside noise. It's a house meant for focus, for burying oneself in stories. Yet over the past several days, that very stillness has begun to feel oppressive, where once I found comfort in the hush of empty rooms, now I felt an unshakable sense of being watched. It started subtly after that first whispered name. I stepped out of the shower, heart racing. The mirror was fogged over and I couldn't see my reflection, but there were strange streaks in the condensation, almost like someone had traced lines across the glass. I wiped my hand through the steam, trying to banish the shapes. My fingertips trembled, and when I blinked, I swore. I saw a droplet crawl upwards on the mirror rather than sliding down. The image was so uncanny that my pulse lurched. I shut my eyes and counted to 10, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks when I opened them. The droplet was gone, and I dismissed it as a figment of fear that was a mistake. A few nights later, I was in my study reviewing notes for a new manuscript. My desk lamp sputtered with an irregular hum, and I leaned close to read some scribbled lines in my notebook. Outside, the wind rattled a loose window frame each gust, banging it just enough to set me on edge. I usually don't scare easily, but my nerves felt raw, as though they were wired to the smallest disturbance. Then I heard the whisper again, faint but unmistakable. My name, it was carried on the hush of moving air, or maybe from somewhere deeper in the house. I sat up so quickly my chair groaned in protest, my skin erupting in goosebumps. I tried to ignore the slow creep of dread invading my gut, even though my mind screamed that this was impossible, that no one else was in my locked home. The sense of intrusion was overwhelming. The dryness in my mouth forced me to swallow hard, and my breathing grew shallow, as if something had stolen the oxygen from the room. That evening I barely slept. I lay awake in bed staring into the darkness, every nerve tensed for the slightest movement. No further sounds came, but the night pressed in on me as though it carried a secret. It refused to share when the sun rose. I felt the relief of daylight, but a part of me knew that was only a temporary reprieve. The next day I tried to channel my anxiety into writing. I told myself that focusing on the page would ground me. Instead, I found I couldn't recall some of the ideas I'd been developing the previous week. I opened my files on the computer, scanning paragraphs I recognized in my style but had no memory of composing. Each line described a man losing his grip on reality in a house that seemed to breathe on its own. The words cut me to the core, not because they were terrifying, though they were dark in tone, but because they felt like they belonged to me. Yet they bore no trace in my memories. I decided to take a break. Drinking a glass of water in the kitchen, I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps I'd written those paragraphs in a late-night frenzy and forgotten, but I'm too meticulous for that. I always date and label my documents. I take pride in my process. Still, I forced myself to remain calm that afternoon. The calm shattered when I noticed an eerie sheen on the walls of the hallway near my office. It looked as if someone had splashed a transparent viscous fluid onto the wallpaper. The substance glistened under the overhead bulb, and a faint musty odor wafted up, making me wrinkle my nose. I ran my fingers lightly across the patch. Feeling a slick texture, my stomach tightened with revulsion. As I stepped back, I realized the liquid was slowly spreading, forming faint lines. At first it looked random, but then I realized it was shaping into letters. My breath hitched in my chest. There on my hallway wall, my name was taking shape, letter by letter, and what looked like sweat or slime leaking from the house itself. I took a stumbling step backward, colliding with the opposite wall. My heart felt like it was going to smash through my rib cage. Every heartbeat pounded in my ears, merging with the sensation of blood surging through my fingertips. I fled to the bathroom, scrubbing my hands raw under hot water as though the sticky substance might have clung to my skin. When I looked up at the mirror, my reflection stared back at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. The face of someone who no longer felt safe in his own home. That night, I tried to sleep with the lights on my bedroom lamp cast harsh shadows on the ceiling, warping the shape of the overhead fan every time I closed my eyes. I saw that glistening fluid shaping my name. At some point, exhaustion took over and I slipped into a restless slumber. I dreamed of water dripping from the ceiling in the exact formation of letters, each drop echoing with my name in the dream. I tried to shout, tried to run, but my legs felt stuck in thick mud. The next morning, I woke to find a page of handwritten text on my nightstand. The paper was old-stained around the edges. My handwriting covered the page, describing a scene in the future, my future where I was frantically cleaning walls that pulsed like living flesh. The detail was excruciatingly vivid down to the shape of the wooden beams behind the wallpaper. I remembered none of writing it. My entire body broke out in a cold sweat. My hands trembled so violently that I almost tore the paper as I tried to read it. I told myself I would call someone, maybe a contractor, to check for leaks or mold, or a friend just to keep me company. But the realization sank in. I couldn't recall any of my friends' phone numbers when I tried to picture their faces. The images slipped from my mind like water through cupped hands. I began to panic. I had always prided myself on a sharp memory, able to recall even small details from conversations. Now it was as though entire sections of my life were dissolving. I had the vague notion that I used to chat with people regularly, or that I had once belonged to a local writer group, but all of that felt unreal, like a half-remembered dream. Later that day, I ventured out of the house, desperate to outrun the suffocating atmosphere, but as I sat in my car, the sense of disorientation only increased. I couldn't remember the direct route to the grocery store I'd visited countless times. My skin prickled with dread, and I turned the ignition off. I found myself staring at the reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing a new tension in my jaw. My eyes flicking nervously to the back seat. Every second brought an onslaught of confusion, and I realized that the more my name was called, the more I lost some force. This entity in the water was taking hold of my memories, piece by piece, determined not to give in. I stormed into the house and started cleaning the walls. I grabbed rags, buckets of soapy water, anything to purge that fluid. My heart thundered with each swipe of the cloth. My breath jagged in my throat. But every time I wiped a spot clean, a new drip would appear elsewhere. Slowly writing out fractured words or partial sentences, I saw half-formed phrases like "help me" or "listen," but they vanished before I could confirm if they were truly there. My sanity teetered on a razor's edge as the walls became a shifting slate of glistening messages in the midst of this frenzied attempt at cleansing. I heard the whisper again, my name clear as day. A searing pulse of pain hammered through my temple. I stumbled, pressing a hand to my forehead. A swirl of confusion knocked me off balance and I sank to the floor. My vision blurred, and as I tried to recall who I might call for help, I realized I couldn't even remember the name of my publisher. My hands felt clammy, my breath ragged. There was a growing hollowness in my mind, as though someone had carved out a chunk of my memories with a scalpel. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to stay present. I refused to let this thing strip me of everything I was. I crawled to my desk, rummaging through drawers until I found a small handheld recorder. If I was losing my memory, I needed some method of anchoring myself. Pressing the record button, I spoke in a raspy voice about the experiences, forcing out every detail I could remember. The whisper in the shower, the walls sweating words, the lost manuscripts, the discovered pages that I had no recollection of writing. I poured out my fear, describing the slippery dread that had taken up residence in my brain. Even speaking felt like an act of rebellion against whatever was preying on me. Hours passed. I didn't dare shower, didn't dare even wash my hands. I was terrified that the water itself was its domain, a doorway through which it whispered and took. I felt grimy, sweaty, but the prospect of letting water cascade over my skin made me tremble with primal fear. My clothes clung to me. My mouth parched, but thirst was preferable to risking contact with the entity. Eventually, I noticed another page on my desk, one I hadn't placed there. My heart pounded so ferociously I thought I might faint. I read the text with a growing sense of dread. It described me sitting exactly where I was, in the same chair holding the same piece of paper. It recounted line by line the entire day's events and ended with a cryptic sentence about water giving voice to something that wanted more from me. The final line, "He will be called again." I threw the page aside, my breath hitching in shock before I could process it. I felt a chill in the air. My name whispered again, so close it seemed to caress the back of my neck, my whole body locked up, every muscle drawn tight like a twisted coil. Sweat broke out on my forehead and my breath became labored. I was losing more memories. I could feel them evaporating behind my eyes. The cold wave of panic stole the rest of my composure. I could no longer remember the names of close family members. All I had were fragments of old birthdays' faces without context. Rising to my feet, I clutched the recorder. I forced myself to move my. One hope was to confront this presence, to demand it leave me alone, or at least to bargain for my identity with trembling steps. I went to the bathroom. The tub and sink were silent, but the air felt heavy and I could smell dampness, as if the entity lingered just beyond the porcelain. I looked at the mirror, half expecting to see letters forming in the condensation. Even though I had not turned on the shower, I refused to speak instead. Focusing on my reflection, my eyes were wide-ringed by exhaustion. My lips parted in a shallow gasp as I tried to gather enough courage to ask in my thoughts what it wanted. I felt something brush the hair at the nape of my neck, a subtle moist sensation like a droplet of water creeping where it shouldn't be. My heart pounded so fiercely that my chest ached. No voice answered in words. Instead, I had a sudden vivid sense of drowning. Not physically, but mentally, as though my memories were swirling down a drain, carried away by a force that fed on them. My entire life was being siphoned off page by page, replaced by these cryptic prophecies. I found scattered in the house. I realized that if I didn't break free, I would become nothing but a vessel for this entity's story. In a surge of desperation, I turned on the sink faucet. Water splashed into the basin and I watched it swirl down the drain. I glared at my own reflection, demanding silently that the presence appear. My face felt hot, adrenaline flooding my veins. I was shaking. The air smelled like damp earth, and behind me I heard the walls groan like old wood under extreme pressure. Yet I held firm. I refused to move until I felt the presence shift. Then, for just a heartbeat, I saw a shape flicker in the mirror, a silhouette that wasn't my own, translucent like water-cold terror. Rippled through me, but I stayed rooted in place. I silently told it that I was not going to run. In that instant, I felt a sudden release of pressure in my skull, a swirl of memories. The grocery store's layout, the name of my publisher rushed back in a jumbled flood. It was as though a dam had cracked, letting pieces of me slip free from whatever had stolen them. My knees nearly buckled with relief. I grasped the edge of the sink, breathing hard, tears springing to my eyes. The presence lingered, but it seemed to recoil, as if my act of confrontation had weakened its hold. I shut the faucet off and stared at the dripping tap. The entity was still there, humming at the edge of my consciousness, but I sensed it retreating without a word. I left the bathroom, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. The daylight felt harsh against my face, but it was real, tangible. I slid into my car and drove away from the house. Though I struggled with the route, the memories were returning in fits and starts, enough for me to navigate. I don't know if I can truly escape this thing, if it lurks in every drop of water I encounter, or if it is bound to that old house. But I do know that each time it called my name, it chipped away at me. I suspect it might still have fragments of my life locked within its watery depths. Even now, I sometimes hear my name whispered in the faint patter of rain against a motel window. My heart rate spikes and my hands start to shake. But then I remind myself that I fought it once. Perhaps if I keep reminding myself that I exist beyond its domain, it will never again have the power to unmake me. Still, there's an unsettling chill whenever I stand under a shower or pass by a dripping faucet. Part of me wonders if one day I'll wake up and find another page describing a future I can't remember planning. I've come to accept that the most haunting terror isn't the sight of some monstrous entity, It's the slow unraveling of one's sense of self, the fear that you can be erased from within. Leaving only a husk behind whenever I close my eyes, I recall the moment I stared into that mirror and witnessed the faint silhouette of something that had claimed my memories. It communicated through water creeping through the pipes and the walls, turning my sanctuary into a living nightmare. But I refused to let it claim me entirely. I fought back by recognizing what it wanted my identity and holding on to it with all the strength I had now on the road. I keep driving. I'm heading somewhere new where the shadows of that house can't reach me so easily. Yet the tension never fully releases my pulse races whenever I step into a bathroom or see a sprinkler jetting arcs of water over a lawn. My paranoia flares at the faintest moisture on a window pane, but I survived its whispers. I may never be fully whole again, but at least I'm not a nameless echo. I am still me, and for now that is enough. Even if every raindrop that pings against my windshield seems to murmur my name, I will remember who I am and I will not let it take me.